of Justice has been weaponized against him. There's been one interesting thing, Lester and Laura, as we talk about the broader Republican Party and how they are in some ways coalescing behind that particular call, and in other ways starting to draw real distinctions about the national security element here. Listen, you have a House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, who just in the last 24 hours pointed out, well, the bathroom that those documents in, bathroom doors have locks. You heard that from Republican Byron Donalds, another very close Trump ally on Capitol Hill, saying, hey, there's 33 bathrooms at Mar-a-Lago. Like, it's not like guests were in and out of where these documents were stored, essentially trying to downplay where these documents had been, according to the indictment.
Well, let me ask you this. You talk about he's kind of working from a playbook. Is it clear, is he running for acquittal or is he running for president with this outreach that he's running?
I think it's the latter, Lester. I think based on all of the public statements that Donald Trump has talked about, he is running for president here. If he were running for acquittal,
those would not be the argument
I was just going to say, it is likely that his attorneys would be telling him, please don't be truth socialing on your way to the courthouse, right? And so clearly, he is talking about this on his own, very publicly, unprompted at his rallies and at his events that we've seen even since this indictment came down. He wants this to be a part of the broader conversation. And let me tell you why some other Republicans are jumping on board with the idea. They say that the DOJ deserves criticism, that it's been sort of a tool of partisan politics. Half of Republicans agree. Half of Republicans don't think that the Department of Justice, they see the department unfavorably, same with the FBI. They think that they have little faith in the Department of Justice, according to polling over the last 8, 10, 12 months, and including just recently in March. It is a notable shift for the party, as you have Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, calling on defunding the special counsel altogether, away from that law and order ideology that Republicans had for so long campaigned on. This is a shift, and Donald Trump is driving it.
So, Laura, walk us through. He is presumably in the building right now.
Yeah.
If you can walk us one more time through the processes, we'll see.
So at this point, I don't know that we'll be able to see him. You can see the split screen there. It looks like it's hard to know there. You see a number of people going in. We know he's accompanied, obviously, by his attorneys and his body man, Walt Nauta, who's also been in charge in this case. We'll look to see if we can actually get a shot of him. But the fingerprinting, the electronic fingerprinting, not ink, the scan, the paperwork, they'll upload a stock photo into their internal booking system, we understand. All of that will be behind closed doors. The public should not see any of that. The time when the public will see him, of course, is when he first enters that courtroom and takes a seat at the defense table.
And he will be arraigned not by the presiding judge in this case, but by a magistrate.
Exactly. So a magistrate judge, think of it almost as a judge's helper. They're here because the criminal justice system has to churn so many defendants through. Magistrate judges are there to do this first appearance, this first initial step in the criminal justice process, and that's where the magistrate judge, John Goodman, will inform him of the charges. It's likely that the prosecutor won't actually read everything out. He knows the charges. He's seen the indictment, as we all have at this point. And then he will be expected to enter a plea at this point. Now that his attorneys, there was some debate about whether his attorneys were barred in the district. Now that we've confirmed he has an attorney, Chris Kise, who is actually barred in the Southern District of Florida, it's expected that he will likely enter a plea. And then at some point soon, though, there will be a date for him to actually have all of this happen in front of the judge, the presiding judge, Judge Cannon, who will actually preside over the trial of this case.
Okay, and we'll remind folks the cameras are not allowed in federal courthouses or courtrooms, so we will see no video of anything transpiring inside. On the left, that motorcade reassembling for when the former president is completed with his arraignment, presumably having entered a plea and will be leaving. So we'll continue to watch that show. That shot. Let me bring in former U.S. Attorney and former senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. He's also an NBC News legal analyst. Chuck, we haven't talked about on this broadcast why we're here, why in Miami when we saw so much grand jury activity take place in Washington. What's the significance of this happening here?
It's a great question, Lester. So the United States government has jurisdiction over these crimes because they're federal crimes. Your question goes to where is the best place to try this case? And that's a concept known as venue. Venue is a bit of an elastic concept. Under the law, venue is appropriate, proper in any place where a crime is begun, continued, or completed. But when you look at the facts of this case as alleged in the indictment, the overwhelming number of those facts allege conduct in the Southern District of Florida. And that's the locus of the obstructive conduct, for instance. So prosecutors don't want to do things that are risky. They want to minimize defects or deficits in their case. And one way of doing that, though venue might have been proper in the District of Columbia, is to bring the case in the place where it's absolutely appropriately venued, the Southern District of Florida. Again, sort of the central point of the obstructive conduct. And that's why, Lester, you find yourself with Laura and with Hallie in Miami, Florida today.
Is it somewhat of a risk, however, for the prosecution in terms of the potential jury makeup when you look at this thing geographically? Also, the judge in this case is being looked at carefully for some of her previous rulings that appear to favor the former president. So is Jack Smith at a bit of a risk here?
I've heard that talk. I tend to discount it. Let me explain. For instance, we tried in the Eastern District of Virginia, in Alexandria, Virginia, one of the 9/11 conspirators. Our courthouse is 3 miles from the Pentagon, one of the buildings attacked that horrific morning. We weren't looking for a jury that never heard of Al-Qaeda or never heard of 9/11. That would be an alarming group of citizens. We were looking for people who could put aside what they heard and be fair. All you need on the jury are people who can be fair. And when the judge is screening jurors for this case, she's going to look specifically for people who say, look, I might be a Republican, I might be a Democrat, I might have voted for Trump, I might have voted for Biden, but I can put all that aside and listen to the evidence adduced in the courtroom at trial and render a fair and just verdict. My experience with juries and with jurors is that they do that all the time. They try very hard to be fair and to be logical and to abide their oath, to put aside any preconceived notions they might have about the case. So I tend to discount concerns that you can't find a fair jury in the Southern District of Florida. Lester, I think you can.
All right, Chuck, we'll ask you to stand by. It's the top of the hour for those just joining us. Let's recap where we are this afternoon, what we've seen and heard so far. Former President Trump's motorcade departed his Doral, Florida country club. At around 1:30 p.m., he arrived at Miami Federal Court at about 1:55 p.m. to surrender to U.S. Marshals ahead of his arraignment on 37 counts. Trump and Walt Nauta have arrived at the courthouse where he, too, will be arraigned on charges in this case. Mr. Trump and Mr. Nauta will be released. They will fill out paperwork and have digital fingerprints taken before facing the judge for today's proceedings. Mr. Trump will not have a mugshot taken. As we understand, they will use a previous existing photo of him to put into the file. Let's bring back our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. Laura, what happens now when essentially this kicks off the case? You have the arraignment, face the charges, guilty, not guilty. Now it begins.
Yeah, we really are at step one of what is going to be a lengthy process. And we've talked, obviously, so much about the charges that he's facing in this indictment. But we should help our viewers understand this is one slice of a bigger mandate that the special counsel has. He was put on to actually investigate not only the former president's retention of these classified documents and the alleged obstruction, but he's also investigating the former president's efforts to stay in office, to cling to power, his efforts to block the certification of the election, to pressure his former vice president to do the same. And so when we talk about the political implications and the timeline and how all of these things run into each other, we have to sort of help our audience understand there could be more to come. We know just today the grand jury in D.C. was meeting. There are witnesses still going in front of the grand jury. We've reported that his former senior advisor and close ally Steve Bannon has been subpoenaed in front of that grand jury. Will prosecutors secure that testimony for trial? There's so many open questions.
Wait a minute. So the indictment we saw, I think you called it a speaking indictment.
Yes, it is a screaming indictment.
Screaming indictment in this case.
Yeah.
But it may not be all.
No, and we, even in this indictment, it's not clear if this is all we'll see on this charges. They talk about people known and unknown to the grand jury. They could always file what's known as a superseding indictment if there's new information gleaned, if there are cooperators that come around on this case. They could file even more charges. Not saying that they will, but that's something at least that our viewers need to understand. This is a small slice, and we are only at the very beginning of a very long process.
And that's actually, not to pile on here, but that's in addition to, Laura, something you alluded to, which is the case down in Fulton County, Georgia, where the lead prosecutor in that instance has suggested and has made a lot of indications that if there is going to be action taken against the former president there related to his push to overturn the legitimate results of the Georgia election in 2020, it'll likely happen sometime in maybe early to mid-August, right? So it's not over on the federal level. It may not be over on the state level. And when you look at the timing, not to get my political nerd brain going here, but you look at the first debate for the Republican primary, that is set to be in late August. So it's entirely possible that you will have a collision of a number of these legal issues that Donald Trump faces as he is sort of entering the really big push of the start of the primary season. It is early days, though, as Laura points out. There is still such a long way to go in both of these
early days, and it makes me think, we've gone from one shock to one shock to one shock in this country, and we move on. This is a long, long time before trial and for even the primary. So will it be hard for Mr. Trump to sustain this campaign, if you will?
To that, I would say he sustained a campaign largely based on grievances ever since I started covering him in 2015, Lester, and that includes his time in the White House here. He is somebody who understands and who can communicate when he feels personally and professionally aggrieved, and I don't think based on past precedent there's much indication to think that'll change this time around.
Especially since this is part of a larger story for him. If you look at how he talks about the Justice Department, how he attacks prosecutors, he goes back to the Mueller investigation, right? And so he creates a larger narrative so that this fits in perfectly with everything that he has already said that he's been wrongly persecuted about.
That has been an effective argument, too, for some Republicans who still, just on the phone in the last 24 hours here getting ready for today, still bring up the Mueller investigation and the way that there are Republicans who feel that was an example of this, what we're talking about now, what they're talking about now, the idea that the DOJ, they say, has been weaponized.
All right, we know that the former president is still here because we hear the helicopters over that have been following his motorcade. So whether the actual arraignment has begun, it's not clear. You see on the left side of your screen some of the security teams that are around this area. They have essentially left mostly freedom of movement except right up at the federal building itself here. So you've seen some of the protesters come back and forth. Sam Brock has been watching some of the crowd. Sam, what are you seeing?
So, Lester, you hear the helicopter sounds right now, also the megaphones from where I am with the crowds. You can probably hear this. I'm not standing too far away from where you're seated right now, as there has been sort of a crescendo of activity here in the last 10 or 15 minutes. Clearly, the crowd is aware that Trump is inside of the federal courthouse right now. They're chanting, USA, USA, we love Trump, a variety of other chants. Lester, I want to take your attention, though, to a video that we captured from above just a short while ago of a protester who's one of the few anti-Trump protesters here today, wearing a prisoner outfit, approaching the motorcade. Now, Lester, this is on the other side of the federal courthouse. Where I've been reporting from is where you're allowed to stand, where protesters are congregating. On the other side is where they brought the president into the building, and you'll see him approach the motorcade and immediately be stopped. So, in some sense, it's testament to the fact that the security plan here is working. Although we also saw maybe an hour ago someone walking right next to the federal building behind me holding up a sign that says, "This ain't Fifth Avenue," and that person, Lester, just strolled right along the federal courthouse. Now, there's been a lot made so far about the fact that there's no hardened borders, or hardened perimeters, I should say, which means that you won't see, generally speaking, metal barricades or jersey walls or anything of that sort. In terms of security and blockading the presence of people, what you see here is just some police officers, several police cars preventing you from getting into the main area, into certainly the entrance of the building, and then I'm told the street on the other side of the building, that is blocked off, and that is where President Trump arrived. But as we stand here right now, this crowd, I would estimate, is somewhere in the neighborhood, and this is a rough ballpark guess based on where I'm standing, 1,000+ people. The plans, according to the city of Miami, federal officials, DHS, is they can sort of expand and or retract their police presence from 5,000 people to 50,000 if it's required, but nothing along those lines or scale so far. But it really has picked up, I would say, in the last 15 or 20 minutes.
All right, Sam, thanks very much. Hallie?
I just wanted to make a point, just because I've been to dozens upon hundreds upon millions of Donald Trump events over the course of the last 6 years or so. and just how remarkable it is that there is such an intermingling here of protesters with counter-protesters, with members of the media. This is not typically, right? Of course not in the White House. There is a bubble around the president when he travels. And even for the former president, that exists, right? That Secret Service protection, which of course he has here. But it is just for people who may not, this is very different from how it usually goes when you go to a Donald Trump event and get this close to wherever the sort of quote-unquote action is.
All right, let me go to Frank Figliuzzi. He's a former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI and the former number 2 at the FBI's Miami office. Frank, thanks for joining us. You know this turf well. What's the thought on the security plan here that's allowing some of these protesters to get up to the motorcade in some cases?
Yeah, this is uncomfortably close by Secret Service standards. They prefer a hardened perimeter. They prefer a distant perimeter. But there was push and pull and give and take with the city and county authorities. And this is what we've got today. The good news, Lester, is that these numbers so far of protesters appear to be only in the hundreds, not in the thousands. And that means they're far more manageable numbers for the law enforcement community. I think people need to understand, to plan security for an event like this, including the transportation and movement, you're looking at least 10 agencies, local, county, state, and federal, all trying to coordinate and get their piece and their preferences in here. And what I like to tell people is, just as Laura mentioned, that we're in the first step of the legal process, we're also in the first step of the security process. By that I mean, we're looking at a protracted period of time as the trial starts and moves forward, where law enforcement is going to have to get it right every single day. And that lone offender that's out there only has to succeed once. So good news, low numbers. Good news, intelligence did not indicate the planning of organized groups. I think this is a test, a measure of the chilling effect that over 1,000 arrests related to January 6th have had on organized violence and sent that message. I think we're seeing that today. The question is whether we'll continue to see that chilling effect moving forward.
All right, Frank, thanks. Laura, let me ask you, is a defendant required to make an appearance at every hearing along the way?
Not at every hearing along the way, but he's obviously entitled to hear the charges against him. He's entitled to confront the government. It's his right under the Constitution to have that
I'm asking in the context of what we're seeing now. Is this going to become the norm for everyone?
No, but this will come to a head should this reach a trial. And that's where things could get really interesting. As Hallie was alluding to the timeline here, we already know he's facing one trial in March of next year, in the thick of the primary season. If he's facing another trial, this could get tricky in terms of, is he supposed to come off of the campaign trail? Exactly, and that could become very complicated, and a judge is going to have to look at that really carefully.
And by the way, New York State has a trial it wants to conduct, presumably ahead of this one.
Well, and usually, whichever one is filed first gets to go first. There's not supposed to be some deference to the federal indictment, but it will be interesting to see. Obviously, you saw the special counsel already signal he wants to move very, very quickly in this case, but it may not be up to him. And this is where the judge can play a huge role in either slowing things down or keeping things on pace. If the defense files a bunch of motions to try to stop this, pretrial motions to either dismiss it entirely or to gut some of the evidence, she can take as long as she wants to resolve those motions.
And that turns us to our next guest, NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Danny, walk through the potential defenses for Mr. Trump. We've heard a number of them tried out over the last weeks leading up to this moment, but what are some of the solid areas of consideration, do you think?
Don't look to the words that are coming out of Trump's mouth for his possible defenses by his legal team. I expect at the end those will diverge considerably. Instead, look for the defense to argue early on that this is selective prosecution. In other words, this is the to prosecute. That being said, the motion will not work. Statistically, they never work. And even when they do, since 1996, the Supreme Court has said the remedy isn't even necessarily dismissal of the charges. It might be something like a fine or a sanction of the prosecutor, and a defendant doesn't care about that. A defendant wants a dismissal. Beyond that, there will be other pretrial motions. One theme will be essentially that Trump, along the way, tried to comply with the National Archives, tried to comply with DOJ. It was the archives that set unyielding deadlines. It was DOJ that didn't allow rolling production, that set an arbitrary deadline. Now, will this work? It's hard to say.
All right, you're looking at a picture, a photograph of what we believe is the former President Trump waving from the motorcade as it arrived here in Miami for this hearing. A little hard to make out, but we believe that is the former president. We don't quite know what he was looking at that point, if he had a good look at the crowds or simply some of the security forces out there. But just wanted to share that with you. And let me stay right with you for a second, Danny. We talked a moment ago about things that the defense may want to get tossed in terms of evidence. I asked Laura what the low-hanging fruit was. I'll ask it to you.
You look at all the evidence that is coming in the indictment. So the defense doesn't have discovery yet. They will get discovery. The arraignment is the official kickoff of the case. And then the defense will think about what motions it wants to file. There may be something in discovery that they don't see from the face of the indictment. All of those are fertile ground to try, and I stress try, to get suppressed. The reality is the vast majority of motions to suppress fail. Judges are not inclined to grant them, and frankly, the bar is just very high. But you make those motions as a defendant anyway. You make a record, and you hope maybe if you lose them that the appeals court might look at it with fresh eyes. But I expect you're going to see a lot of pretrial motions in this case, some of them dispositive to try and throw the entire case out. Those two rarely succeed. The bottom line is this: whether federal judge or state court judges, they don't like to take cases away from the government, from the prosecution. They're far more inclined to let them go ahead. But probably the biggest motions will not come pre-trial, Lester. They will come at the end of the case, when the defense asks a judge to take the entire case into her hands and enter an acquittal, notwithstanding what the jury may have said. And that determination could be unreviewable. In other words, there may be no comebacks if the judge grants that motion. Now, that's yet another motion, Lester, that is almost never granted and statistically is not likely to be granted even if Trump is convicted. But it is something to think about.
All right, let's bring in former U.S. Attorney Paul Charlton. He was appointed by former President George W. Bush. Thank you for being with us. I want to get your thoughts on this notion of how Mr. Trump can delay. And again, we should point out that, you know, he certainly has the right to make whatever legal requests he wants. But what are some of the things at his disposal?
So the most effective defenses, Lester, in any criminal case are delay, delay, and delay. As we were just discussing, there are a number of substantive and case dispositive motions that we can expect to see from President Trump's lawyers.
Paul, I'm going to have to interrupt you just for a moment because Trump's spokesperson, Alina Habba, is speaking outside the courthouse now. Let's listen.
It is about the destruction of the long-standing American principles that have set this country apart for so long. In recent years, we have seen the rise of politically motivated prosecutors who don't care for impartiality, who don't care for due process or equal protection of laws. They have been quietly but aggressively cultivating a two-tiered system of justice where selective treatment is the norm. From the Russia hoax to the attorney generals to the corrupt DAs in Georgia and New York, and now this. The people in charge of this country do not love America. They hate Donald Trump. What we are witnessing today is the blatant and unapologetic weaponization of the criminal justice system. The Biden-appointed special counsel has sought fit to bring 37 federal charges against President Trump, the leading frontrunner, less than a year and a half before an election. countless other individuals, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden himself, retained possession of classified documents yet have not been prosecuted. And none of them came into possession of those documents while they were president. None of them were president who, as the head and sole member of the executive branch, has the power to summarily declassify documents. The decision to pursue charges against President Trump while turning a blind eye to others is emblematic of the corruption that we have here. We are at a turning point in our nation's history. The targeting, prosecution of a leading political opponent is the type of thing you see in dictatorships like Cuba and Venezuela. It is commonplace there for rival candidates to be prosecuted, persecuted, and put into jail. What is being done to the President Trump should terrify all citizens of this country. These are not the ideals that our democracy is founded upon. And this is not our America. Thank you.
So what's happening right now inside the courthouse? Has he been arrested? Has he...
All right, Alina Habba speaking outside the courthouse, a Trump attorney making a number of claims that we've heard the former president make, not breaking any new ground there. Let me ask Laura and Hallie, fact check some of this. One is that he had the power to summarily declassify documents. Not true.
No. And again, to note, they're not his documents. These are documents that are the property of the United States government. We're talking about weapons plans. We're talking about defense plans. We're talking about a plan of attack against Iran, according to prosecutors. These are not just his diary or his notes. These are top secret or secret records. And they've chosen a selective few, so secret, in fact, that some of them, the titles had to be redacted, even within the indictment, which shows you sort of the gravity of it here. And she's making a lot of arguments that we've heard, familiar, sort of almost parroting things that we've seen on the president's social media, and she's saying them in a different tone, but they're actually the very same types of claims about the weaponization of the DOJ. But their only evidence for that, Lester, is the fact that other people weren't prosecuted, and yet those are very different cases. Those are not cases in which someone was given a grand jury subpoena and continued to hold on to documents and tried to convince their own attorney to lie to the DOJ about it.
We haven't seen anything quite like this, in
We've
fact.
never seen anything like this from anyone, let alone the former president of the United States.
Now, she is delivering a political defense of her client, far less so a legal one, with very little on the actual merits of what was in the indictment in the first place. That may work outside court. It's going to have to be very different inside court to be persuasive to a judge, to a jury, in all likelihood here. I thought it was interesting, the mention of Cuba and Venezuela. Probably not coincidental, given where we are right now in South Florida and the importance of those communities to the Republican political bloc where we are. All of it speaking to the idea that, as we often say about those close to the former president, she is thinking, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but likely an audience of one here for whom it is important to hear. And hear Donald Trump's attorneys, he wants to hear them making this defense of him. He, I'm sure, is going to be looking at clips of this crowd outside the courthouse, Lester, and glad to see people here supporting him.
And he'll be making remarks later on this evening, probably along the same lines.
Again, it's the idea of that, and it sounds sort of wild to say. We talked about an impeachment playbook while he was in office. Now we're talking about an indictment playbook, because it has happened before. This is what we saw after those state-level charges in New York. He went and had this semi-rally. We anticipate something very similar tonight. Remember, he spends the heat of the Miami summer in Bedminster, New Jersey, at his home and his property there. So he'll be returning, he'll be delivering remarks, likely going to be a forceful condemnation of this arraignment, of the process that has happened here, Lester.
And we should we'll point out just some housekeeping as to where we are now. We understand that the booking process is complete. The processing of both defendants, Walt Nauta and the former President Trump, has completed. So they would go on then to the actual arraignment phase.
Yes, and we should also note just how unusual it is that Walt Nauta, obviously alleged to be his conspirator in this plan to kind of secret the documents, but he's still his body man. He's still his valet. He's traveling down to Miami with him. And one of the things to watch for when this actually gets in front of the judge who's presiding over it is whether she says anything about whether those two should still be communicating. Usually in a conspiracy case, you might not want to see the two communicating after that indictment.
That's something the judge would want to do, or his attorneys?
No, it's something you might actually see the judge bring up, and perhaps the prosecutors will bring it up, not today, because today is the magistrate judge, but to see the presiding judge say something about that will be interesting to see. They might actually, be prohibited from still talking at least about this case, even though they still work together. Again, highly unusual factual circumstance we have here.
Let me go back to Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, you were listening, I'm sure we heard a moment ago, from a member of the former president's team offering a defense that we know well. Is that anything like what's going to be being said in court today, or will be said in court along the way?
No, it's an excellent question, Lester. In order to admit a document, let's say in the public square, all you need to do is wave it in front of a television camera. To admit a document or to admit testimony in federal court, you have to meet strict rules of federal evidence. A judge is the gatekeeper, of course. In court, there are fewer gatekeepers in the public square. And so Mr. Trump and his supporters can say whatever they want for public consumption. The defenses, quote unquote, that you heard offered just a few moments ago on your network are not the types of arguments that a federal judge is going to admit at a trial. They're not admissible, they're not relevant, and they don't adhere to the rules of evidence. And so I think it's important for viewers to understand that there are some things that are for public consumption, perhaps for fundraising, and there are other things that are for juries in a court of law. And those two buckets, Lester, are very different things.
All right, Chuck, thanks very much. I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker, again. Kristen?
Well, Lester, you were just talking about Walt Nauta, and Laura there was outlining his role in his relationship to former President Trump. And just to give a little bit more context about who Walt Nauta is and why there is so much focus on Walt Nauta, he is 40 years old. He spent 20 years in the Navy. He then went on to be a valet at the White House and then to become former President Trump's body man. He was personally involved, according to this indictment, in the packing and moving around of these boxes, which contained classified and sensitive information, as was former President Trump, by the way, as well. One of the notable exchanges in the indictment that has gotten so much attention that involves Walt Nauta, let me just read you a part of this, Lester. This was a question that he was asked by investigators, quote, "Do you have any information that could help us understand where they," meaning the documents, the boxes, were kept, how they were kept, were they secured, were they locked, something that makes the intelligence community feel better about these things, Walt Nauta, according to the indictment, responds, I wish I could tell you. I don't know. I don't. I honestly just don't know. And Lester, that exchange happened after he was shown on surveillance video moving the boxes from one location to another location after a subpoena had been issued for these classified documents. And so that is one of several examples in this indictment that has gotten a lot of attention in terms of what we are talking about when we think about the obstruction charges that Walt Nauta and that former President Trump are facing, Lester.
All right, Kristen Welker, thank you. Let me bring back NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd. Chuck, give us your thoughts about what's happening in the Republican Party right now. We heard some of those very early statements before most had even had a chance to look at the indictment. Watching this process play out now, presumably full knowledge of what's in the indictment, where does that take the party?
Look, the party, the more it follows Donald Trump down this road, the more the party separates itself from the very voters it needs in order to get a governing majority, whether it's in the House of Representatives, the United States Senate, or the presidency. And that's what's so, the more the base rallies around them, the more this turns off the middle of the electorate. And it's that slice that decides Georgia and Wisconsin and Arizona and Pennsylvania. And it's, there's been so much of this. And what's fascinating is every Republican that's speaking, these elected Republicans know it and believe it. And there is one what if I keep wondering, is I wonder if we didn't have the New York indictment, Lester, and this was the very first indictment, I think there would be a lot more elected Republicans who would have looked for distance first before putting their finger in the air. Obviously, the result of the Manhattan indictment, the political result of it, made all of these elected Republicans decide to go out there and condemn first and ask questions later of the indictment. And who knows if there would have been a slightly different reception if this were the first one, rather than what happened in Manhattan. And I would argue in the Manhattan thing, it reminds me of the Clinton impeachment. Everything that he was accused of by the Manhattan DA was something many voters knew before the 2016 election, right? The Access Hollywood tape told them that information. It's like Bill Clinton. The impeachment of him, hey, they knew that when they voted for him. That wasn't going to be disqualifying. But if the first indictment had been professional misconduct, rather than the first indictment be character misconduct, I just wonder if the Republican Party leaders might have been braver at condemning him for this.
Chuck, I'd like you to speak to this whole issue, these accusations that this is politically motivated, weaponized Justice Department. Is it fair to say that for Democrats, this is politically advantageous?
Well, here's the thing. Yes, it is. But what is the Justice Department supposed to do when somebody defies a subpoena like this? It's sort of like we're prosecuting a 20-year-old Air National Guardsman for releasing all of this classified material on Discord and some other places. And it's sort of the two-tiered justice system is not there, but Donald Trump is actually calling for one. He wants special treatment. The elected Republicans are all but saying there should be special treatment for the political candidates, not for others, that somehow there's different levels of this. And look, it's hard to prove a negative, you know, and I think the Justice Department goes through the same problems you and I go through, Lester, when people like come at the media, hey, you're not covering this, you're not covering Y, and we're sitting there going, hey man, we're just covering the story. We're covering the reality of the moment. We can't cover what you wish were reality. We're simply covering what it is. And I think the Justice Department is sort of stuck here. You know, Donald Trump never should have been charged for this, but he himself made behavioral decisions to force the hand of justice, because if they didn't do it, then you would set an example that would make all of these laws that govern classified documents completely moot. And then who knows what that would do to our system of secrecy in this country, which does have national security implications.
All right, Chuck, thanks. We are approaching the bottom of the hour. For those just joining us, here's where we stand. Let's recap what we've seen and heard so far. Mr. Trump and his alleged co-conspirator, Walt Nauta, were just processed and booked inside Miami federal court. That means they filled out paperwork. They had digital fingerprints taken, no ink, before facing the judge for today's proceedings. Mr. Trump will not have a mugshot taken. They'll be using a pre-existing photo of him to complete their files. They arrived at the Miami federal court at about 1:55 this afternoon to surrender to U.S. Marshals ahead of his arraignment on those 37 counts. The pair to be arraigned soon officially. Keep stressing no cameras allowed inside the courtroom. That's the norm in all federal courtrooms. Let's bring back NBC's Sam Brock nearby out with protesters. Sam, does the crowd have any sense of where this stands right now, or where the former president is?
So there seemed to be sort of an uptick in the response, Lester, when Trump's attorney came out to address that pool, and then sort of the volume has dissipated a little bit since, although it's still fairly high. If you look over my shoulder here, to give you a different perspective, we're now closer to the street off Miami Avenue. These are all the folks that are out here. It goes back probably 50 to 70 people deep. And what's amazing about this visual that you're taking in right now is not just the fact that the only barricades are beyond the crowd in front of the courtyard, but all these tents that you see are the members of media who are all standing in the same space together. The protesters, people who live here that just wanted to see a footnote of history, came out. Multiple people have stopped me just to say, you know, what do you think of all this? And I say, who are you? And it's just someone that lives nearby that wanted to take it all in. And obviously, police presence as well. We know that they were prepared for 5,000 to 50,000 people. We are nowhere close to either one of those numbers as we walk through this space, Lester. One notable thing to point out is that it was right over here earlier today that one of the canines, that bomb-sniffing dogs, came by and actually sat on a piece of luggage or what had an LED TV monitor inside. They cleared out this entire space for about 30 to 45 minutes. So all of the people that were out here, members of the media, demonstrators, bystanders, all cleared out. This was empty at like 11 o'clock this morning. And now, obviously, you're looking once again at sort of front and center history in Miami, downtown Miami, as President Trump is going through this legal process right now. And the crowd has stayed about where it was the whole time. I spoke with Francis Suarez, who's the mayor of Miami. He said they have not received any credible threats of violence. And that was as of a couple of hours ago. So authorities here feeling pretty comfortable about the fact that, yes, there have been demonstrations. We've seen a few moments where there's been confrontation, not a ton of physical confrontation, but people right in each other's faces. But thankfully, there's been no significant incident so far, and the Department of Homeland Security has been scouring this entire area. Miami police, we've seen a couple hundred of them out here today on bikes in what is right now about 90-degree heat with a heat index over 100 degrees. So stifling conditions have not gotten poured on yet, but you would imagine when that 2 or 3 o'clock downpour that is so infamous for Florida comes down, it could clear some of these folks out. But right now, it's a steady presence as people here just want to see what's going to happen and generally speaking, voice their support for former President Trump.
Yeah, you had to tempt the weather gods. All right. Thank you, Sam Brock, because this area is famous for those late afternoon thunder showers. Let's bring in Catherine Christian. She's a former Manhattan assistant district attorney and an NBC News legal analyst. Catherine, I want to ask you, Chuck raised this a moment ago about the order of these prosecutions. We know, of course, New York State and the hush money case came first. Can you, for a layman, compare these two different cases and which appears to be more serious or put the former president in more legal jeopardy?
Oh, well, it's night and day. This special counsel indictment is far more serious than the Manhattan DA's office case. That case involves hush money payments to a porn star and a Playboy model and falsifying business records to cover that up. Serious, but this involves national security. It's important that the people understand the documents that Mr. Trump allegedly willfully retained. Almost half of the entire U.S. intelligence community's information and intelligence was impacted by the retention of these documents. 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information. 21 of those counts, well, 31 counts all pertain to a specific document. 21 of those documents were all classified as top secret. Top secret is defined as if the document were to get into the wrong hands, it would cause severe damage to the national security, grave damage, to the national security of the United States. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about these documents. Documents that were left in boxes that didn't have secured covers. These were not kept in a vault in Mar-a-Lago. They were in a ballroom. They were in a shower. They were in the bathroom. There's a photo in the indictment of a box dropped to the floor with documents spilled out. One of those documents was a very secret document that was called For Five Eyes Only. Five Eyes Only meaning 5 countries: Australia, Canada, the UK, the United States, and New Zealand. A very secret document. And that's listed as one of the counts in 31 charges involving willful retention of defense information. So, all due respect to my former office, that's a serious indictment in Manhattan, but this is the real deal.
No, we appreciate you breaking it down. Let me bring back former U.S. Attorney Paul Charlton. He was appointed. I think we're going to make a change here. We're going to go to Carol Lamb, an NBC News legal analyst. Carol, you've been watching the conversation today, watching the crowd here to greet the former president. What are some of your observations here?
Well, I can tell you one thing. Jack Smith, the special counsel, is not concerning himself with what's going on outside the courthouse today. Jack Smith's whole concentration now is, as it was completing this investigation, it is now how this investigation is going to, how this indictment is going to go to trial, how the former president and his aide, Walt Nauta, are going to be up in front of a jury, what is going to be admissible as evidence, and how this trial is going to be administered. That is his focus right now. A lot of people think that prosecutors do this kind of work for their own personal glorification. That is not the case here. That is not the case with this special counsel. One of the things that struck me about this indictment when I read through it is fundamentally how simple a case it is and what an excellent job the special counsel has done in putting together the facts here. He has text messages and he has videotape that permits him to put together a very clear timeline of what happened, when those boxes were moved, and why they were moved. And the other thing that's really striking about the indictment, before we saw the indictment, you might have thought, well, perhaps the former president kept these facts, kept the boxes and the subpoena and the response to the subpoena at something of a distance. Maybe he didn't really know what was going on between his attorneys and the government. That is clearly shown not to be the case. It is clearly shown by the text messages of Walt Nauta and other employees at Mar-a-Lago that former President Trump was hands-on in what boxes were going to be reviewed personally by him and what documents were going to be reviewed personally by him. That's an extraordinarily persuasive amount of evidence regarding to what the former president did in this case.
Yeah, Carol, I have another question for you, but I want to quickly show some pictures we have from earlier. I think it shows former President Trump leaving the Doral Country Club for the 20-minute or so drive. There it is. This is earlier. They're heading out, presumably, to the vehicles before making their way here for the arraignment, which should be taking place right about, well, within the next half hour or so. We're told the booking is completed. And Carol, as we watch that, I want to talk about how does a prosecution deal with a case like this? They know there is going to be this public campaign. They know there is the political element. Do you have to acknowledge it? And in some ways, did Jack Smith find a way to quietly acknowledge the politics of this while maintaining the integrity of his case?
In circumstances like this, Lester, of course the special counsel knew that there were politics around this, that everything he said or did, or the fact of the indictment was going to have some kind of political ramification. And he was well aware that if an indictment was going to be brought, it should be brought as quickly as possible with respect to the Department of Justice policy not to do anything too close to an election. So he was certainly aware of that. But going forward, he really has to focus on this case and let other people take care of extraneous information. He's now brought the indictment. He has to focus on trying this case.
All right, Carol, thank you. Let me bring back Hallie Jackson. Hallie, as we watch all this play out, Carol mentioned that DOJ rule that limits what they can do in terms of a prosecution surrounding politics near around an election, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
As far as the political campaign, and that's something we've heard about in previous instances, right? And I think Chuck Rosenberg and Carol and others will tell you it is not a hard and fast law or rule. It is more like a guideline for the Department of Justice. We saw it come up in other instances previously. But the piece of it here, as it relates to Donald Trump and his potential legal jeopardy, does link with the political side of it. And the idea that this is, and this has been brought up by some Republicans publicly, and I will tell you privately, self-inflicted, that he did this to himself, that we would not be here if he had not kept those documents. And as I think Carol rightly notes, was extraordinarily personally involved in the handling and management and sorting of those documents to a degree that really hadn't been previously reported, at least on the full scope of it.
Personally involved, and at least in the prosecution's telling, cavalier. One of the photos that's involved in the actual indictment shows the documents just spilled out everywhere, and Nauta takes a picture of it and texts it to someone like, oh my God, look at all these documents.
The beautiful mind documents, they called some of these files.
But the idea there being the carelessness with which you're treating the national security secrets of the United States, and again, it shows you how the political maps on to the legal. What is more important to the fitness of office for the presidency of the United States, right? He's not just the former president. He's running to occupy that office again. What's more important than treating our national security secrets sacred?
And yet you are seeing, even just in the last hour, I think, since we've been on the air and since Donald Trump has left Doral and come here, you are seeing the top Senate Republican, somebody who has no love lost for Donald Trump in the least, essentially take a pass on making any kind of comment on this indictment or on the charges or on the seriousness, Laura, of what you're talking about here. Mitch McConnell simply saying, I'm not going to start commenting on the various candidates we have running for president. It is also true that there is only one candidate running for president who is facing a federal indictment on these serious charges related to obstruction, related to these national security secrets of the United States of America. He's also getting backup in other corners from the Senate, which is a different beast than the House, if you will. While John Thune, for example, a member of Republican Senate leadership, called these charges serious, you are now seeing Senator J.D. Vance say that he is going to put a hold on all Justice Department nominees until, in his view, Merrick Garland, he says, drops what he believes is an unwarranted case against Donald Trump. Now, he can slow it down. He can't stop it altogether. But it also shows you there are policy implications that Republicans can pull some levers on here, too.
All right, let's, on that issue of slowing it down, let me bring back former U.S. Attorney Paul Charlton, appointed by former President George W. Bush. I apologize, I had to cut you off a bit earlier, but you were speaking to this very issue of that Mr. Trump's perhaps most effective defense tool will be the ability to delay.
That's right, Lester. And so there are a number of substantive motions that we can expect former President Trump's lawyers to file here. A motion to suppress the search warrant, a motion to reconsider the decision that allowed President Trump's, actually compelled former President Trump's lawyers to testify before the grand jury. And a whole number of other motions that they will undoubtedly file. Those motions will take time for Judge Cannon to review, for the prosecution to file responses, and depending on who wins or loses those decisions, there will likely be some appeals that follow those motions as well. And we can't forget that there is a very good reason for the president to at least ask for and seek a continuance in this trial. He's running for president of the United States, and he faces, as we've discussed, other charges for which he needs to be prepared, and we can expect, we think, there may be other charges coming as well. All of that is going to be before Judge Cannon, and it is likely, in my view, that she will continue the case. The objective for Trump's lawyers is going to be to continue this matter until after the election, because that election is going to determine, in no small part, what happens to this prosecution, because depending on who wins the next election for President of the United States, it may very well impact how it is this prosecution goes forward, if at all.
All right, thank you for that. Let me bring back our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker. Kristen, we have been noting that a number of Republican candidates have kind of sided with the former president on this. They've had his back, but not all, notably Chris Christie. I understand we're hearing from him.
We are hearing more from Chris Christie, who remembers not only the former governor of New Jersey, also a former U.S. attorney, who just tweeted, Lester, the GOP must stop blaming our adversaries for the weakness of our candidates. It's Trump. He's a three-time loser. He ends by saying, loser, loser, loser. This is significant for a couple of reasons. Look, Chris Christie has come out swinging since the moment that he entered this campaign, but he is basically saying to the other GOP candidates, now is the time to draw a sharp distinction with former President Trump. If not now, when? He has been very forceful, including at a town hall overnight, essentially making the case these are very serious charges that he is facing if they are true. He's making a second part of this argument, though, Lester, which is that he is saying, look, former President Trump hasn't won anything since 2016, effectively blaming the losses of the 2022 midterms on the former president as well, and calling on his fellow GOP candidates to sharpen their attacks, to join him in this chorus. We saw Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador, also shift her tone, start to become more critical of former President Trump. Another U.S. attorney, Asa Hutchinson, also quite critical of Trump. Ron DeSantis, though, his closest rival, has not taken direct aim. Neither has Tim Scott, someone who's gotten a lot of buzz as a potential VP nominee. And if you look at the polls, Lester, we've been saying this throughout our coverage, Trump's base of support remains incredibly strong. It remains unchanged. The numbers anywhere from 35 to 40%, maybe even going as high as 60%, depending on how you're counting. Those voters are not for the taking. Those are people who are not going to be moved. However, there are some moderate Republicans in some of the open primaries, for example. There are some independent voters who are for the taking in a primary. And what you're effectively hearing from Governor Chris Christie is, look, if you want to get some of those voters, if you want to shake up this race and not repeat what we did in 2016, which was effectively not lay a hand on Trump and allow him to walk away with the nomination, then you've got to get tougher.
Can lower your ability to fight infections, including
At the end of the summer, we'll have to see, but Chris Christie really leading the charge here, Lester.
All right, Kristen Welker. Kristen, thanks very much. Hallie, what do you have?
It's not surprising that Chris Christie, the former New Jersey governor, is taking this tack, because that is what his campaign is resting on the foundation of. I mean, he is in this race, sure, to win the White House, but in many ways to take down Donald Trump. And he has been the loudest and most outspoken voice against him. For somebody, by the way, who ran his transition for like a brief moment right after Donald Trump initially won the election back in 2016. Obviously, that relationship has since soured, and Christie in many ways sees it as his mission to be the voice speaking out against Donald Trump. His point, loser, loser, loser. Well, Donald Trump will hear that. But I will tell you that behind the scenes, there are other campaigns whose strategy rests on portraying Donald Trump as a loser. Not that explicitly, but I think of, for example, sources close to to current Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, the governor of the state we're in here, who are likely to be rolling out a strategy of painting Donald Trump as somebody who cannot win on issues like, as it relates to culture wars, on education, on LGBTQ+ issues, ways that Ron DeSantis has been effective here in Florida to advocate for those conservative causes, and Donald Trump has been unable to do. So it is a difference in how you deliver the message, right? But ultimately, that appears to be the message that many Republicans will coalesce around. Now, that said, let's also say Chris Christie is not indicative of where the Republican Party is writ large, for all the reasons that Kristen laid out. We talked about how Nikki Haley, who's also running against Donald Trump, came out, sharpened her tone, talked about how the allegations laid out in this indictment are reckless. She also now is saying that she may consider a pardon for Donald Trump if he is convicted, if she ends up winning the White House, because she says of what it would do, what a conviction of Donald Trump would do for the country here.
Shows you how the ground is shifting minute to minute, right? Like, they don't quite know where they want to land on this, but Christie wants to differentiate himself, and he is not in like the highest position. And so, as a former prosecutor, what do? You use what you know, and he knows the law.
And nobody else has that.
And nobody else has that benefit. And if you're already ranking sort of low, what do you have to lose?
I think that's a huge part of the strategy here for Chris Christie. There's also a question of what does it mean if and when Georgia and that potential indictment comes down in mid-August. I will tell you that in my conversations, that is a kind of a data point to come in maybe 6-8 weeks from now, that there are some campaigns looking at, waiting to see, does the tide change if that comes down to? We don't know yet.
Let's not forget, we're also watching Georgia and a potential for a criminal indictment with regard to the election. And what would that do to the political environment? I mean, we would once again force candidates to choose.
Well, that one's interesting because remember, the central allegation there would be that he actually tried to pressure a fellow Republican.
That's right.
And I wonder if that one makes it a little bit different. You would think that mishandling national security secrets for a party that has sort of stood on the principle that that's something to regard and to be careful with would treat that seriously. But you wonder if pressuring a fellow Republican might be treated differently. It might not. So far, it doesn't seem like anything's been able to really pierce through, but we'll see.
Let me bring in Chuck Todd into the conversation. Chuck, there's a lot to chew on here. Also, I want to get you to weigh in on independent voters. We're seeing how this is animating the former president's base, but we've talked long before all this that he still needs those independent voters.
He does, and this continues to alienate them. But that is not what the focus is, right? And this is where, to really get at the root of this, I really think we have to accept the fact that there's just an alternative conservative media apparatus that is just got an alternative reality, an alternative set of pieces of information. I hesitate to use the word fact there. But it comes where there's just this echo chamber in one side of things, where negative partisanship, and if the media says it's bad, then we're going to rally around and say it's good just because these elites tell us it's bad. And this is what's alienating the middle, and we're setting ourselves up for an election. We've always used this as sarcasm. Oh, it's the lesser of two evils, and this or that, and we've had versions of this. But this really is putting voters in the middle where they're not voting for anybody. They're just simply voting against what appears to be the most unstable result that they want to avoid. Excuse me.
Yeah. What do you make of this talk of pardons?
Look, I don't think a former, it's interesting. You know, there's quite a few other democracies that have had foreign leaders under criminal probe. Some have served time. Some have worn ankle bracelets. I'm waiting for the candidate to say that they would commute his sentence, but not necessarily pardon him. I could understand if you decide, you know what, don't let him be a martyr in jail. He shouldn't serve time, but you shouldn't wipe out his conviction either. So if you're wanting to know what do I think actually would happen if Donald Trump were convicted, I think we're more likely to see someone commute his sentence someday, but I don't think he'll ever be pardoned for this.
All right, Chuck Todd, thanks very much. A little before 3 here on the East Coast. We're still waiting for word that the former President Trump has officially faced his arraignment. We know that he has been booked. The fingerprinting has taken place, and that he has essentially been processed. But the next step, and the point of all today, was for his arraignment. So we're waiting for word from inside the courthouse. While we're waiting, let's bring back our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker. Kristen, if you could talk once again to the seriousness of these accusations.
Well, Lester, we know that former President Trump is facing 37 counts of obstruction and espionage charges. And one of the things that stands out about the indictment is that it alleges that Mr. Trump shared some of these classified documents, some of this sensitive information with other people, and also has quotes of him effectively ordering his attorneys to conceal these classified documents. In one example, this goes back to July 2021. This is in Bedminster, New Jersey. Trump showed and described a quote-unquote plan of attack that he said was prepared for him by the Department of Defense. He was showing this to an author who was helping one of his top aides on a book. Trump told the individuals in the room that the plan was highly confidential and secret, and said, as president, I could have declassified it, and now I can't, you know, but it is still a secret. On August, or on or about September of 2021, also in Bedminster, the former president showed a representative of his Political Action Committee, his PAC, who did not have security clearance, a classified map related to a military operation, and told the representative that he should not be showing it to this person and that this person should not get too close. A couple of other examples, Lester. He said, according to this indictment, to one of his attorneys after a subpoena was issued for this classified information, I don't want anyone looking. I don't want anybody looking through my boxes, these boxes that contain this classified information. I really don't. I don't want you looking through my boxes. He goes on to say, what happens if we just don't respond at all or don't play ball with them, meaning these requests for the documents? Wouldn't it be better if we just told them we don't have anything here? And then finally, he says, isn't it better if there are no documents? All of this gets to former President Trump's state of mind while you have the National Archives, federal authorities demanding to get these documents back. And here's one more critical exchange, Lester, that I just want to read for you. This was one of the conversations that he had with his attorney after the subpoena had been issued for these classified documents. This is according to the attorney telling investigators, quote, he made a funny motion as though, well, okay, why don't you take them, the documents, with you to your hotel room? And if there's anything really bad in there, like, you know, pluck it out. And that was the motion that he made. He didn't say that. So that's from one of his attorneys at the time. Lester, the significance of all of this, putting this all together, again, the indictment is really trying to provide a window into the former president's state of mind as it relates to these classified documents, and to show that he understood the significance of the documents, of the request, and that he did not want to hand them over. And then one more point I will make, the indictment also provides a number of examples from 2016 when former President Trump was attacking his rival at the time, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, for her handling of classified documents. Of course, she was investigated for that. She was not charged with a crime, but in a number of instances, he lays out how he sees the mishandling of classified documents, speaks to how critical they are as a national security matter. And the point of that, this indictment, investigators, prosecutors really trying to show that he understands not only the significance of these documents, but the fact that he was withholding them and not complying with these requests to turn them over, Lester.
Yeah, Kristen, I want to pick up that thought with Catherine Christian, a former Manhattan assistant district attorney. Catherine, to that point, it sounds like it'll be very hard for the Trump camp to claim that, you know, these were underlings that did it. He was not fully connected. He wasn't aware of what they were doing. That sounds like a tough sell.
Yes, this indictment closely shows how closely Mr. Trump micromanaged these documents, how he micromanaged the packing, the storage, the retention, the moving. There is even a text message included in the indictment from his co-defendant, Mr. Nauta, to another employee stating he's tracking the boxes, and the he refers to Trump. More to follow up today on whether he wants to go through more today or tomorrow. So the use of that word tracking. So Mr. Trump micromanaged every aspect of his retention, his alleged willful retention of these documents.
All right, Catherine, thanks. We are approaching the top of the hour, and for those, excuse me, just joining us, we want to recap what we've seen and heard so far today. Mr. Trump is inside a Miami federal courtroom where he's facing a judge to be arraigned. That is scheduled to take place at 3 o'clock Eastern, which is 3 minutes away by my clock. That means he'll be formally charged on the 37 counts in the classified documents case. The former president expected to plead not guilty to the charges against him. He has already been booked and processed, meaning he's filled out all the paperwork. The fingerprinting is done. He's recorded his phone number and other pertinent information. We should remind there are no cameras allowed in a federal courthouse. We will not see any of this. The pictures you're seeing right now are of his departure from the Doral Country Club. We will get more information from inside the courtroom as soon as it happens. We've got a plan worked out to get folks down here who can give us a flavor for what's happening. But right about now is the scheduled arraignment. Again, these pictures a bit earlier as Mr. Trump was about to hop in that SUV and make his way over to the courthouse here in Miami. Let's bring back our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. We've arrived at that time. We believe he's being arraigned. For those just joining us, walk us through what we think is happening about now.
So again, this is under normal circumstances, perhaps a 10 to 15 minute process, and it could go very quickly in this case. It's a magistrate judge that's overhearing this. It's not the case that it's not the judge that will actually preside over the eventual trial. The magistrate judge will call the case. They'll hear. He's entitled to obviously hear the charges, but he already knows what they are. Then he's expected to enter a plea. There might be some discussion about another court date, although the judge who's ultimately going to take this case to trial, Judge Eileen Cannon, is the one who will set that date. But it could be over relatively quickly. One thing that will be interesting to see once we confirm who all is in the courtroom, it would be, interesting to see whether, in fact, Jack Smith is in the room. We haven't seen very much of him, Lester. We actually managed to see him on camera very briefly last week, just walking the street, but he's maintained a very low profile. He's only spoke one time when the indictment was actually unsealed to stand up for the rule of law and to stand up for his colleagues at the Justice Department, but that was highly unusual. Otherwise, we haven't heard anything out of him. Now, not saying if he's there that he'll be the one who actually stands up in court, but it's a showing of solidarity for his colleagues who have been under attack.
And if he is there, I think it would be incredibly notable because Donald Trump has been attacking Jack Smith in a serious way, calling him things like a deranged psycho, suggesting without presenting evidence that he is in some way partisan or compromised as part of this investigation. The former president and his legal team have gone after the prosecutors handling this case, making allegations of prosecutorial misconduct, again, without presenting evidence, but obviously the investigation continues into the dynamic of if that is the case, and I don't want to get ahead of our skis here, but if Jack Smith and Donald Trump are in that courtroom together, it is going to be, I think, a significant moment just optically and visually, probably for both of them, but especially for the former president who has really put Jack Smith, the special counsel, in the bullseye.
There's also some question about President Trump's legal team as to, he's lost, 3 members now in the last...
He lost 2 members just hours before the indictment was unsealed, which was something of a surprise. And it was interesting that we were questioning whether they had been fired or whether they quit. They put out a statement saying they had resigned. He hasn't blasted them, at least that we've seen on social media, and so perhaps they ended on good terms. But query how in the world you have a situation where the former president is facing felony serious charges and he doesn't have the most robust legal team that money can buy. Anybody else in this type of situation, think about any other defendant who is well-to-do and has the wealth and privilege of someone like former President Trump. They would have law firms lined up, but in this case, that is not what we've seen. We've seen people quitting at the last minute, and he does have at least one member of his team, Todd Blanche, who's also on the Manhattan hush money case, and so he's managing these two major cases against the front runner of the Republican Party.
And keep in mind who Donald Trump wants as his attorneys. He doesn't just want people who will defend him legally. He wants people who will also defend him politically. This came up in the indictment as we looked through some of those details that we've been talking about even in just the last couple of minutes. You saw in many ways the expectation that Donald Trump wanted his attorneys to be fighters for him first. Right, to be the people who would back him up on all fronts, right? I mean, this is something we've seen from him through the course of years of him having attorneys on various cases, et cetera. He wants people who will, like we saw from his attorney earlier in this special report, who came out in front of the courthouse and spoke. He wants that political defense as well as the legal defense too.
Let me bring back Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, you're privy to this conversation we're having here. Explain how this will work after the arraignment, the motions that we may see, and the process going forward.
Certainly, Lester. Well, Laura was talking about the fact that the arraignment today, which is really a rather perfunctory hearing, is in front of a federal magistrate judge. The action will then move to the courtroom of a federal district court judge, an Article 3, and by that I mean presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed, lifetime tenured
Chuck,
Judge
let me interrupt
Eileen
you here
Cannon.
for a second. We just got word from inside the courtroom that Mr. Trump has pleaded not guilty. Our correspondent, Gabe Gutierrez, has been in the courtroom. He's going to run out here shortly. We should get a little bit more information, but that tells us at least that the arraignment is underway. He has formally entered a plea of not guilty. He does have, of course, the presumption of innocence. And Chuck, we've talked about delay tactics and dragging feet. All these things are allowed. It's part of the process. How does a prosecutor, though, try to gain... Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go to Gabe Gutierrez. Gabe is out right now. Gabe, what can you tell us?
Hey there, Lester. Well, we just ran out of the courthouse in an overflow room where some reporters were able to listen to the proceedings, which are still underway. Just moments ago, the counsel for former President Trump, Todd Blanche, entered a plea of not guilty on behalf of the former president. Former President Trump is sitting inside that room, and at the defense table, he's sitting at the same table as Walt Nauta, his alleged co-conspirator. We can tell you we're able to see through a video feed, again, the proceedings still underway, and the former president had his hands crossed on that table. The judge in this case, the magistrate judge, just had arrived, Jonathan Goodman, and was going through several procedural steps. The defense waived the reading of the entire indictment, which is typical in this court system. And so now the proceeding continues to be underway. Again, the former president pleading not guilty on this sweeping 37-count indictment. I can tell you that he also appeared with co-counsel. Chris Keyes, a Florida-based counsel. Todd Blanche also is representing him. He is, of course, the well-known white-collar defense attorney from New York. Stan Woodward, another attorney, is also in the room. He is representing Walt Nauta. There were several members of the special counsel's office there. The prosecutors, I'm going to list them: Judy Edelston, Jay Bratt, and David Harbuck. Again, this all unfolded over the past few minutes, Lester. The proceedings began just before 3 o'clock. We did not see the former president enter the room. The video feed started up when he was already seated. It is a packed room. There were some members of the public there, as well as members of the media. And again, we were let in early this morning. We're taken to a media overflow room. No phones, no devices of any kind were allowed. This is an unprecedented arraignment, Lester, as I'm sure you've been discussing, the federal arraignment of the former president. Now, Todd Blanche, again, this is different than what we saw in New York several months ago. In New York, the former president got up and said the words "not guilty" himself. In this particular case, he let his attorney, Todd Blanche, do the talking, saying, "We most certainly plead not guilty." Again, the proceeding is ongoing. Just before the actual arraignment started, we were told the former president was booked, that he had his fingerprint taken with a digital device. And again, we were told that he did not have a mugshot taken here, that they would use a previous photo, that no mugshot would be taken here. So again, that's the latest we have from inside the courtroom. The former president of the United States pleading not guilty to this indictment, Lester.
All right, Gabe, just to be clear, Jack Smith then was not in the courtroom?
We believe that he is in the courtroom, Lester. It was difficult to see exactly who was in the courtroom. It was a grainy video monitor. We did speak with somebody from the U.S. Marshal's office who did tell us that Jack Smith was in the building, and we believe that he may have been seated in the first row. Again, we're trying to get confirmation on that because of the quality of the video feed, but we were told by a spokesperson for the U.S. Marshal's office that Jack Smith was in the building. We believe we saw him in the first row, but certainly several members of his team were there representing the government, seated just feet from the former president, Lester.
And I understand the video feed was of poor quality, but did you get any sense of the former president's reaction to anything that was going on?
He had his hands in front of the desk in front of him, on the desk in front of him, Lester, as the proceeding got underway. When the magistrate judge started speaking and laying out some of the charges, he then crossed his arms very briefly and was listening to the proceedings unfold. Now, I can tell you, Lester, this is different than the proceedings that we saw in New York, because it just seems to be that much shorter at this point. The plea came just within a few minutes of these proceedings getting underway, and so there was not the discussion, the motions that we saw in Manhattan in the hush money case, where there was immediately some discussion and there almost seemed to be opening statements from the prosecution. This delved right into it, and the magistrate judge asked the former president's team to enter a plea almost right off the bat, just several minutes into this arraignment. Again, no reaction from the former president, and we could not hear if he was, may have been discussing anything with his counsel. We can tell you that Walt Nauta was seated 2 people from him. If I could set the scene, there was the defense table and the prosecution's table, of course. 5 people seated at the defense table. Walt Nauta seated second from the left of that table. The former president seated second from the right. So they were almost side by side as they face these charges. And I can tell you, Lester, speaking with some legal observers, it is remarkable to see that happen. They are alleged co-conspirators in this case. Whether or not there might be conditions placed on the defendants as this case moves forward, whether they can speak to each other or not. Very difficult in this case, considering that Walt Nauta works for the former president. And as of now, they seem to be in lockstep, seated at the same table. Again, Nauta with his own attorney, the former president with 2 attorneys, one based in New York, one now based here in Florida. And again, these proceedings are still underway. We are waiting to see what else comes of them as this arraignment moves forward. If I can give you some background, Lester, on what we experienced today as members of the media here. We were brought into the courthouse, brought to the 5th floor. We went through one metal detector and were kept there. Again, no access to devices, no access to cell phones. We did see through a window the former president, as I'm sure you saw as part of our live coverage, being brought into the building, his motorcade going into a secure portion of this federal courthouse. Then we were told by the U.S. Marshals that he was processed. Again, as I said, no mugshot taken, but that process didn't seem to take very long at all, if only a few minutes. Then there was a system where Some reporters were let into the actual courtroom. It was a packed courtroom, large courtroom with room for several dozen people. And there were also some members of the public there as well, though very few. It was mostly made up of reporters. But again, for those just joining us, the former president pleading not guilty to the charges against him, not saying the words not guilty himself, but rather letting his counsel, Todd Blanche, do the talking for him, Lester.
All right, Gabe Gutierrez, thank you for your excellent reporting from the courtroom. A sense of what's happened there. Again, the former president now has entered a plea of not guilty. Laura, let me just get your thoughts. First of all, having his attorney offer that plea, do you read anything into that? Is it standard?
It's totally standard. Just so for folks at home who might be wondering if there's any practical difference about entering it yourself versus having your attorney do it, it's totally dependent on the judge and the court's practice. So there's no practical difference. Obviously, we would be interested in any words spoken by the former president in this context. But at this stage, we wouldn't expect him to say much of anything at all. I do find it interesting that the special counsel is there. We've talked about the fact that we haven't seen him very much. He's made very few public remarks, only earlier when the indictment was actually unsealed. And so the fact that he's there supporting his two colleagues, one of those colleagues, Jay Bratt, the head of the counterintelligence division, obviously somebody very well known within the Justice Department, and also someone that the former president and his allies have been making a lot of unsupported allegations against. And so to have all of these people in the same room at this moment is quite something.
All right, give me your take on Walt Nauta sitting at the defense table together. I mean, are they officially charged together? Nauta is a alleged co-conspirator, so that's the way you would do it.
That's the way you do it. They've been charged in the same charging instrument as it's known in this indictment. And we should also note for our audience, Walt Nauta's attorney is being paid by the former president's super PAC. So their fates here are inextricably intertwined. It doesn't mean that they will always be that way. Of course, we know from our reporting there were times where prosecutors actually tried to get Walt Nauta to cooperate, to turn against the former president, and he resisted those efforts. Query whether that will stay the same, but at least for now, they are very intertwined here and aligned.
Danny Cevallos is watching with us, a defense attorney. Danny, I don't know how much you were able to hear of Gabe's description from inside the courtroom, but did anything stand out to you?
No, because this is an arraignment, and in federal court, an arraignment is really mostly a non-event. It certainly is a significant legal event. It signals the kickoff of the case. It is the beginning of the speedy trial clock. But in terms of what actually happens, most arraignments are measured in minutes, if that. Sometimes they're done in a long list of defendants who have to be arraigned, especially in state court. Less so in federal court, where it's not as crowded. But in this case, I didn't expect anything shocking at the arraignment. There doesn't appear to have been anything shocking or surprising. There's almost nothing surprising that could happen at an arraignment. So limited are the missions of the arraignment, and most defendants don't bother or don't want to have a formal reading of the indictment. So what happens now is a lot of quiet as the cases go, or the parties go back to their corners and the discovery period begins. As the defense assimilates the discovery, examines it, evaluates it, they may ask for more, they may start filing discovery motions, they may start filing dispositive motions, but even those are weeks and weeks, if not months and months away. So the defense, while we have heard glimmers of what they may advance as their defense, they haven't truly started formulating their defense. They can't just based on the indictment. They need to look at discovery. And that, for a defense attorney in a federal case, is often a daunting task because modern discovery, e-discovery, is measured in terabytes. This means thousands, if not millions, of documents that defense attorneys, we have to look at each and every page, even if they're completely insignificant. And it can look like a haystack, and we're looking for the proverbial needle. With Trump, hopefully he can get a team together that can review all those documents, because for a solo practitioner, it can be overwhelming. So they have their work cut out for them throughout the discovery process, which is not something we're going to see in public. It happens behind closed doors, behind the wall of privilege. And of course, another interesting factor is that it appears, although I don't know, that Nauta and Trump likely may have a joint defense agreement, which means that they could possibly be sharing information and retain privilege. Now, here's what happens, though. If one of those people, maybe Nauta, down the road decides that I don't really want to go to trial anymore, then he may have to leave that joint defense agreement if he ever wants to cooperate with the government. Reportedly, Nauta has no interest in cooperating at this point, but everyone knows, prosecutors and defense attorneys alike, that that is only a for now decision. That decision can change over time. As the trial approaches, as this case drags on, defendants who are staunchly, I will never plead guilty, sometimes change their tune as the months drag on.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I want to further it with former U.S. Attorney and former senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, again, these men are considered co-conspirators in this indictment. They appear in court today at the defendant's table. But what is the likelihood that there could be a split there if, in fact, there's a joint defense agreement?
Well, Danny's quite right, Lester. People act in their best interests, and defendants are people. So they also act in their best interest. Typically, for a defendant in a federal criminal case, once they have received discovery, which Danny described, and they filed motions, and let's say the court rejects the defendant's motions and the case is proceeding to trial, the best decision for most defendants in most cases is to plead guilty. Why? Because under the federal sentencing guidelines, which determine the advisory guideline range for a judge within which to sentence, you get credit for pleading guilty. In other words, if you plead guilty and if you cooperate, you could end up spending a lot less time in jail than you would otherwise. In fact, you may end up spending no time in jail at all if your cooperation is unusually valuable. So I wish I had $1 for every defendant who I heard would never cooperate under any condition and later did. When it became apparent what their best interests were and how to effectuate that, pleading guilty and cooperating is often the exit ramp for them. So it doesn't mean Mr. Nauta will do that. He may hang in there. He may insist on a trial. He may or may not be convicted. Time will tell. But many defendants often go their own way. And by the way, regardless of who is paying for his attorney, that attorney has an ethical obligation to Mr. Nauta only. At the very least, they will have a conversation about pleading guilty and cooperating. It would be remarkable if they did not, because Mr. Nauta needs to know what his options are and then to make the best decision for himself. Will Mr. Nauta and Mr. Trump go separate ways? I don't know, but defendants who are charged together and who are to be tried together often do end up going their separate ways. Lester.
All right, Chuck, I'll ask you to stand by. I bring back NBC's Gabe Gutierrez, who we just heard from, came out of the courtroom, told us the president has pleaded not guilty. You've got some more color from in there, Gabe. What can you tell us?
Yes, Lester. So I imagine over the last several days there has been an open question of the Trump legal team in which Florida-based counsel would represent him or help represent him, given that two of his other attorneys had resigned late last week. And, you know, a little bit more about Chris Kise. He's been a fixture in South Florida for quite a long time. He is currently inside that courtroom with the former president. And something that I also heard inside that courtroom, the magistrate judge asked both him and Todd Blanche whether they plan to be here permanently. So this suggesting that this wasn't just a temporary legal counsel and you're here for the trial or trial and appeal. And they both said that they plan to be here for the trial and appeal, suggesting that as far as we know right now, the intention is to keep both of those as part of this legal team, Chris Kise and Todd Blanche. Now, Lester, I also want to talk to you about just some of the differences since I was in that courtroom, in that courthouse in Lower Manhattan when the former president was arraigned on those state charges. Just a very different feel here in South Florida, of course, just in the layout of this courthouse, but also in the proceeding so far. Again, this proceeding is still underway, so I don't know what's going on there at this moment, but I can tell you in the few minutes that I did see, it was a much less contentious hearing than the first one, than the first indictment, first arraignment was several months ago, where almost from the get-go, the state prosecution in Manhattan really started tussling with the Trump legal team almost immediately. So had a very different feel at the start of this proceeding. Again, we were waiting to see when we rushed out of there once the former president pleaded not guilty. We were about to hear Walt Nauda's plea as well. We had every indication that he would plead not guilty as well. But what we're also waiting for at this point, Lester, is what are going to be the conditions of their release? You know, will they be able to speak with each other? You know, the certain questions, and I'll let our legal experts weigh in on that. But what will be some of the conditions imposed, and whether we might get any sort of timetable for discovery. You recall back during the arraignment in Manhattan, there was a lot of back and forth at the tail end of the hearing over the timetable of this case and whether, you know, whether the attorneys could agree on the discovery process here and the timeline here, and the state prosecutors up there had major concerns about whether the former president could take some of that discovery and publish it on social media. There's been a legal back and forth over the last several months about whether he needs approval to post certain things about social media about that charge. So at this point, still a lot of unanswered questions about how this federal case moved forward. Now, for those of us just joining us, I can tell you once again, no reaction from the former president. All I saw him, he crossed his arms briefly and then, you know, put his hands on the table, but no reaction with regards to anything that was said in court just yet. But again, we are waiting from our colleagues that are still inside the courtroom to see how long this hearing is actually ends up. There were some indications it could be potentially a very short hearing, perhaps even as short as 10 minutes. It's now gone well past that. And of course, the unprecedented nature of this case, you know, it's anyone's guess at this point, Lester.
All right, Gabe Gutierrez, a lot of information there. And yes, we do wait on our colleagues who are still in the courtroom to give us a sense of where this is or when it's over and what things may have been discussed. In the meantime, let me bring Hallie Jackson back into the conversation. What are you picking up on here?
Well, I think one of the first indications that we'll get that this arraignment proceeding has finished is probably from Donald Trump himself on Truth Social, as he is wont to do. He has been active on that media platform as he used to be on Twitter here. I wouldn't be surprised if he's got his phone, he's in the car, if he's talking about what he just experienced here. We know that he's getting ready to head back to Bedminster, where our reporters there in New Jersey are seeing the chairs lined up, ready to go, VIP seats ready to go, including for Mike Lindell, for example, somebody who echoed the former president's election fraud lies. Kash Patel, somebody whose name may be familiar to close watchers of these proceedings, who ended up going in and testifying to the grand jury in this very case. It is likely to be a full-throated condemnation of the people who were in that courtroom with him. I'm struck by, if Jack Smith was in court, the way that was a symbolic "I have your back" message to his team, to the people around him, because they have been under attack from the former president and his allies. His sort of inner circle here, who believe that Jack Smith is leading a partisan witch hunt, as Donald Trump often says, against him. And then I think it's also interesting, the Walt Nauta connection here. We talk a lot about how in the indictment, as you're reporting, Laura, you know, there was an attempt to try to get Walt Nauta to testify against his current boss. Donald Trump prizes loyalty to an incredibly intense degree. Donald Trump also sours quickly on that very same loyalty, and I think that's going to be a dynamic to watch between the two.
Speaking of loyalty, it's interesting that the judge is asking the attorneys on the case to confirm that they're in it for the long haul. You know, it's not easy to get out of a criminal case once you're in it. You can't just withdraw. There's actually a process for that, and you have to get permission from a judge. And it's interesting, at least in the case of Chris Kise, in the appearance form that he submitted earlier today, just hours before this hearing, at the very bottom of it, it says that the actual appearance won't be withdrawn if there's any dispute about the fee between the attorney and the client, which is not something that you just see routinely, but sort of speaks, I think, to the nature of the attorney-client relationship in this case. It'll be interesting to see whether other attorneys get added. We know that they're in active discussions about recruiting other members of the team. In a case like this, 2 lawyers is not enough. Obviously, you know, people at home might be wondering how unusual this is. You need a team for a case like this, as Danny was explaining, to go through the mountain of evidence that prosecutors have amassed and to be able to file motions, to write motions, to be able to argue this case as robustly as he's going to need. You really need a long bench for this.
And yet the special prosecutor has got out and said, we want a speedy trial.
Yeah.
Is that something that generally works in the prosecution's favor?
Well, it's interesting. Normally, the right to a speedy trial is for the defendant, obviously, to hold the prosecution's feet to the fire. In this case, you're right. We've heard Jack Smith say that, but it's not really going to be up to him. Again, it's going to all come back to this judge. I know we've talked about it a lot today, but I can't emphasize enough how much power she wields in terms of the timeline.
All right. And will she pick up on the initial hearings? Or obviously a magistrate today.
Yes, now it's out of the magistrate's hands. As soon as they leave today, we will not see him back in front of this magistrate judge. It'll be in front of Judge Cannon.
All right, let's bring back Frank Figliuzzi. He's a former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI and a former #2 at the FBI's Miami office. I'm curious, in looking through the indictment, where you saw the strengths and maybe weaknesses in the government's case.
Well, Lester, it's important as we talk about delay, complications, speedy trial, that we also factor in the potential complications involved whenever classified material is part of the prosecution strategy. And the indictment clearly indicates that at least 31 documents are part of the charges. In fact, each one of those 31 documents constituting a charge of willful, unlawful retention of national defense information. So that the national security community, the intelligence community, has been scrambling with a damage assessment, but yet has had to agree, sign off on the use of those 31 highly classified documents for this prosecution in some way, shape, or form. So how will that delay things potentially? Well, you're talking about defense attorneys getting cleared. You're talking about operating sometimes in a SCIF, which, by the way, the Miami Federal Building has a secure facility for classified information. And you're talking about exposing citizens, jurors, to some classified information. The other thing that intrigues me really about this indictment is about what's not in it, because we know that the search warrant by the FBI on Mar-a-Lago produced 102 classified documents, yet only 31 were chosen for the prosecution purposes. So why is that? And one has to wonder whether the documents not chosen are even at a higher concern in terms of sensitivity, and the intelligence community agencies that may have said to the prosecution, this can never see the light of day. You cannot go with these. And that would be stunning because the ones in the document are highly sensitive.
All right, Frank, thank you. We're getting some indications that former President Trump may be back on the move, that the proceedings may have finished. The garage door has apparently been peeked open a little bit. Let's go to Gabe Gutierrez. Gabe, what can you tell us?
Hey there, Lester. So, yes, I'm trying to see those live pictures, and I can't see them at the moment. But I can tell you what the process was last time in New York. Typically, if we get the indication that former President Trump is on the move, they will typically keep the reporters and the public that is in the courtroom for at least 5 or 10 minutes, potentially, while the former president and his motorcade leave the scene, and then we'll be able to get more information. And we have several colleagues in there in the actual courtroom and in that media overflow room that may give us some fresh reporting on what went inside after we left. Again, as soon as I left, we were awaiting that plea from Walt Nauta. We had just heard from the attorney from the former president. And then we hope to also learn potentially if any conditions for his release. Obviously, if he is on the move, he is, we'll just have to find out what, if any, conditions were placed on his release and what comes next in this case. And perhaps whether there's a timeline laid out for discovery. But again, since there's a magistrate judge overseeing today's hearing, it could be that, we might just have to see another status conference with Aileen Cannon, the judge that is assigned to this case. But again, Lester, just an unprecedented federal arraignment here of the former president, and I'll send it back to you.
All right, we'll continue to monitor this picture for signs that the Trump motorcade is leaving. And toward that, a busy night still ahead for the ex-president, Kristen Welker. He's going to continue to make his appeal to the court of public opinion.
He certainly is, Lester. He's going to return to his Bedminster resort. We anticipate we'll hear from him later on this evening. And I can tell you, in talking to sources inside Trump world, there is a defiance that I anticipate will be on display tonight. All of the things that we've seen on Truth Social, we will likely hear tonight when the former president steps in front of the podium. He will reiterate likely all of those familiar refrains that this is a witch hunt, that the DOJ has been weaponized. And what's really interesting is I've been talking to Republican strategists who say, look, prior to these indictments, the former president was focused on rehashing 2020. That was his big talking point. That was his big selling point. Now he has a new foil. Now he has a new line of attack and basically place where he can focus his anger, his ire, and try to rally his supporters around that. And that is when he is often the strongest. We saw his poll numbers go up in the wake of the indictment in New York. Will that happen this time around? We'll have to wait and see. But one notable thing, someone said, look, there is a question of fatigue here. Do voters start to feel fatigue? Because he continues to fundraise, to ask voters to support him. Is there a moment, and will you start to see some Republican candidates say, look, he's focused on himself and not focused on helping the American people? We'll have to see if that line of attack comes out in some of these GOP campaigns. But I anticipate we will hear a defiant and fired up former President Trump tonight when he speaks, Lester.
All right, Kristen Welker, thank you. Looking down from the helicopter at the crowd here outside the federal courthouse. We are expecting, hopefully, to be joined or hear from some more of our team who've been inside the courtroom monitoring these events. Keep in mind that TV cameras not allowed inside federal courtrooms so that we know video recording of it. We're waiting for the information. We've seen some signs the motorcade may be on the move here shortly. Activity at the garage. So we're just going to follow this and see where it takes us. Let's go back to NBC. Sam Brock, he's out with protesters. Sam, I don't know what your vantage point is, but I've seen a lot of people mingling around, but nothing in the way of a major organization from either supporters or detractors of the former president.
There's a lot of people who are mingling around right now, Lester. The reality is these folks are not going to see former President Trump. The motorcade that you're describing is going to be leaving from the other side of the building. This is all blockaded here. But to Kristen's point a second ago about Trump trying to rally and really energize his base, this was the first time in the history of this country that we've seen an indictment on federal charges against a former president. And this is the crowd here. We're talking about a few hundred people, right? A fraction of what Trump used to get during his campaign rallies. That's what's out here on a footnote to history on this day. I want to show you one other thing as well. As we go to the side of the street that I'm closest to, this is Miami Avenue. And you're not going to see necessarily the motorcade here. You will see cars that are coming through with Trump flags and megaphones and people screaming. This is the street, and the courtroom is right over there. So it's a very unique dynamic here in Miami where they've essentially allowed what the mayor says is free speech, with certainly security preventions. But you can stand a couple hundred feet away, drive your car right down the street here, honk, flags, all of that, a couple hundred feet away from where that arraignment just took place. So I did speak with Mayor Suarez earlier today. He said that there were no notable threats that were made regarding potential attacks or anything violence related. He had not seen any. Multiple sources close to both the FBI and DHS that have been planning the security outlay here also said they had not seen any credible threats of violence. And thankfully, so far today, it has gone rather smoothly. There have been brief confrontations. You talk about all the crowds here, lots of MAGA folks, Latinas for Trump, women for Trump, all different groups. I'm talking to the folks who came out, and not that many of them are actually from Miami. Many people from West Palm Beach County, or Palm Beach County, excuse me, or they're coming from New York or Nashville or Texas or all over the country to be here. But again, just in terms of scale, it's several hundred people. We're not talking thousands. Again, you're seeing another bus come through here. I'm not sure if this is related or not. This most certainly is, with Trump flags. But all this happening in real time. The arraignment of the former president is happening as you have people in Miami just driving right down the street. And again, there was no hard perimeter either. There were no barricades or metal fences or anything of the like that would obstruct someone from coming right down into downtown Miami, pulling up in their car, or walking from their nearby apartment, and just taking all of this in. And that's what you're seeing in real time. People right now lingering around the courthouse, potentially waiting for the former president to leave. They may or may not be aware of where exactly we stand in the cycle of things right now, but it's just an incredible sort of experience to see this cross-section of people here right now with this level of proximity. And the media is all sort of intermixed into this plaza. We're all standing there together. It's a crush of reporters and people who live nearby, and certainly demonstrators who have been out here all day, and all blended together standing this far away, the other side of that building, once again, is where we expect the former president to ultimately leave in his motorcade before he gets back to New Jersey. But this right here is a Miami way of absorbing history, and all of the DHS and local police officers who have been on the ground here, so the county police as well, have been here and provided a steady presence, but not an overbearing one by any stretch of the imagination. It's not like you look around and really feel like they're on every square inch of the space. It's just a lot of people milling around, watching and waiting for the former president to leave the courthouse.
All right, Sam Brock, you continue to watch that. We'll continue to keep our eyes on the garage where the ex-president is expected to emerge shortly to make the trip to the airport, in this case to go back to New Jersey to make some remarks later on tonight. Let me bring Hallie Jackson back into the conversation. Hallie, we haven't talked much about President Biden facing a real discipline challenge as this goes forward.
Haven't talked much about him because he hasn't said much about it at all, Lester, right? I mean, and that is extremely intentional if you listen to the signals that the White House has put out about it, because of so much attention and pressure from Republicans on whether or not this investigation is politicized. I think the White House is very intentionally taking a hands-off approach on that front. And the president today is doing what presidents do, the business of the office, right? And it is a kind of split screen in a way with the former president here as President Biden continues on with his scheduled appearances, with his scheduled interviews, of course, after that root canal yesterday. Now, there is a notable exception to this, of course, and that is First Lady Jill Biden, who at a fundraiser overnight, according to the Associated Press, said she was a little bit shocked by the response of some of these Republicans to this indictment. That is more than what we have heard in the past from people in and around that sort of inner circle for President Biden, but it does speak to the way that I think the White House wants to be sure that the president does not end up accused of having a heavy hand on this, right? The appearance for Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, for Special Counsel Jack Smith, to have full independence is essential for credibility for a large part of the country. You look at the way that a large part of the country sees this, Lester, and based on some of the latest snapshot polling since the indictment, the vast majority of people, something like 80% of people, think it's a huge concern that these national security documents were put at risk. When you look at just the GOP slice, it's much smaller, something like 38%, which again gives you a glimpse into the way that this is being perceived in different corners of the country.
Well, Special Counsel Laura was appointed essentially in anticipation of concerns about conflict, correct?
Yeah, I mean, he was appointed after the former president announced that he was running again, recognizing sort of the extraordinary situation we're facing. The Attorney General announced that he was doing it to try to protect the integrity of the process. And so it's so noteworthy that Mr. Trump keeps saying, obviously, the Justice Department has been weaponized and this is a political persecution, not even a prosecution, and yet everyone is trying to distance themselves from that process. The current president is distancing himself from the Justice Department, and the current Attorney General is distancing himself from the process as well by giving it to Jack Smith, when in the reality, none of them will be immune from the attacks and from all of the vitriol that's being thrown at them. And eventually, the president is going to have to address this. Eventually, he's going to be asked about it in a way where he won't be able to stay silent. And you can imagine at a debate, if Mr. Trump ends up being the nominee, this is going to come up.
And if he does a debate.
If he does a debate, this is going to come up. He's going to be challenged about this in some way. And so for right now, as you said, it'll be a test of discipline. But at some point, he's going to have to say something.
And keep in mind, he's also under investigation from a different special counsel on the issue of retaining documents.
And in a much different posture in terms of the timeline. According to our reporting, that is not nearly sort of in the same position as this one is. He hasn't been interviewed yet, as far as we know. I think there's been some reporting that he would actually sit down with the special counsel that he has. Again, he has his own special counsel, a different prosecutor, Rob Hur, the Attorney General announced would be overseeing that case. But we still don't know anything about what the results will be in that case. As I mentioned, it's just in a different spot in terms of the procedure.
There's also somebody else who has past tense, their own classified documents investigation, and that, of course, is former Vice President Mike Pence, who is now a candidate for the White House himself, officially going up against his former boss. And in many ways, Pence has this very unique ability, alone in the Republican open field because of what he faced, to be able to talk about the national security potential harms, the national security potential implications. You've heard him describe this and his team as serious, these allegations. Obviously continuing to sort of echo the DOJ concern, but he alone in this race has that perspective of somebody who can say, well, I cooperated, right? I did what I needed to do. I didn't get, charged or indicted or arraigned on federal charges here. And I wonder how much we'll see that as this race continues.
Yeah, he could make the Chris Christie argument, right? But he's not. He could say, look, I cooperated. I gave them all the access in the world. They came in for a 5-hour voluntary search. They didn't have to get a search warrant. They didn't have to go through that whole process because I decided to let everyone in. You could see him do that, but he hasn't gone there because he's still trying to do this delicate dance of appeasing the voters while at the same time trying to explain that this is still serious. And it's unclear if he can have that both ways.
Yeah,
let me bring Chuck Todd back in the conversation. Chuck, one of the games that's often played in Washington we call whataboutism, and we see it on both sides from time to time, and it's playing largely here. Hillary Clinton, Beau Biden, President Biden. I'm sorry, not Beau Biden, Hunter Biden. These all come up in a way that could be confusing for people. So walk us through the relevance of these various cases.
Well, look, they're relevant within what happened in that moment, but the biggest difference between every one of these cases and Donald Trump is the cooperation aspect. In that, whether it's the classified documents of Joe Biden and Mike Pence, whether it's the email investigation into Hillary Clinton, whether it's the financial investigation into Hunter Biden, the biggest difference between all of them is the obstruction. And the former president has essentially stood in the way, and he's done this with every single investigation, starting with the Mueller report. In some ways, this has been one of his moves. And, the ultimate, we're talking about the sort of the politicizing of all this. Well, Donald Trump announced in November, 2 weeks after the midterms, simply to dare the Justice Department to indict a sitting candidate for office. And so each hand forced the other, right? He does that. It forces. That's when Garland, who had said he was not going to go down a special counsel, decided to go down that road because he felt as if Trump's decision to be an announced candidate forced his hand, and it put us on this road. But this was an intentional act by Donald Trump so that he could use the cover of his candidacy as his chief defense. Sometimes you don't know where his legal strategy begins and his political strategy ends. He has morphed the two together.
Is the political clock going to run out here at some point? I mean, as we march on toward the primaries and a general election, and given the length of time that this case alone could take?
It's possible. You keep referring to something that I think is very smart during this coverage, Lester, which is just sort of, we're so used to the Trump era has brought nothing but blockbuster, unprecedented moments in history to the point we're numb to it. So it's possible Republican voters get numb to this. They may get worn down. I think Hallie brought that up. That's always possible. I think it really depends on whether he can sort of keep hold on them. The fact is, I thought he'd have worn out long ago, okay? I mean, he wore out swing voters. That we know. We've seen it, 18, 20, 22. That we know. He has not yet worn out enough Republican primary voters to make the party walk away from him.
All right, Chuck, thanks. Let's bring back our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker, as we continue to await the president's motorcade to emerge from the garage. But Kristen, weigh in on the politics here. The clock is ticking. These issues of comparisons between what may sound like similar cases. How's all that playing?
Well, I think one of the big unknowns, Lester, that we're all waiting to see is, will there be more indictments? He's obviously under investigation in Georgia. Could there be an indictment there? The special counsel still investigating the events surrounding January 6th. There could be an accumulation factor if there are more indictments. So that's one thing I think that his political rivals are watching for. I want to go back for a moment, if I could, to the current commander-in-chief, to President Biden. And this is a very deliberate strategy not to weigh in on these indictments, on these legal challenges of former President Trump. his calculation is not only to draw a sharp distinction with the former president and to say, look, the DOJ is separate. Yes, I'm also under investigation for my handling of classified documents, but I'm not going to weigh in on what they are doing. But he's also trying to and aiming to show every day that he is carrying out the duties of the office of the presidency. That is a political strategy as much as it is part of him going about his daily business and trying to say, look, it's business as usual here at the White House. Because Trump is the strong front runner, obviously Biden world is bracing for the possibility that he could be in a rematch with former President Trump again. And so all of this is laying the groundwork for what could be a really fierce fight between these two again if the former president does win the nomination again, Lester.
All right, Kristen Welker, thanks. On the left side of your screen, the overhead shot here of Miami outside the federal courthouse. You can see some of the agents, security folks at that exit where we believe the motorcade will exit here. After a short time, we, as of course, reported that former President Trump entered through his attorney a plea of not guilty in the brief court proceeding here. Walter Nada, his alleged co-conspirator, his co-defendant in this case, seated at the same table. We got the reporting from leading up to the point of his arraignment, so we're not quite sure where we are right now. Let's go to Gabe Gutierrez right now, who was in the courthouse for the first part of the proceeding. What can you tell us, Gabe?
Yes. Get John Allen.
I don't think we have. Gabe, you with us?
No, Lester, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry, Lester. We're trying to get some of the attention, some people coming out of this courtroom. Karen Duva, she's a producer with us here. We're trying to get the latest information. Hi, Karen. Karen, yeah, we're live on the air. Just tell me what transpired, what just happened in the past few seconds.
The last few minutes.
Sorry, Lester. This is, of course, we just saw some producers and reporters, journalists running out of the federal courthouse. Karen, if you could just stand over here, or Lester, if you want to just for a few seconds chat with your panel, and we can get some of the latest information from Karen here. All right. We're trying to figure out exactly what happened again in the last 15, 20 minutes or so since I left the courthouse. So, Karen, can you tell us?
Just give us the high sign when you're ready.
Did he leave?
Yes.
Correct.
Yes, he did leave.
He did leave?
Yes.
Okay.
The release recommendations, the prosecution, surrender passport, no travel limits, no. They said no to all the limits of domestic travel, no. Southern Florida, outside Southern Florida, not necessary. They agreed on all of that, those conditions.
So you're saying no. Who said
the prosecution? Prosecution.
So there are no limits to any sort of travel. So, Lester, those were some of the conditions that we were talking about here. We're waiting to find out what would be the conditions on former President Trump's release. Now, being told by our producer here on the scene, no limits on any travel, no surrendering of passport. Is that correct, Karen?
Passport, avoid all. This is what the prosecution and the defense spoke about 20 minutes about the special conditions, about avoiding all contact with witnesses and the victims. And that's where there was about a 20-minute, not argument, but discussion back and forth. The prosecution feels like they need to present a witness list because President Trump does not know who these witnesses are, and that he has people on his staff, Secret Service, where he will have some communication with them.
Right, and so Karen, if we can stop here so we can bring our viewers in through this, there was a discussion, again, on the limits of this release, and you're saying that was about 20 minutes of discussion. And the question I have for you, was there any limits placed on his conversations with Walt Nada, of course, one of his employees? Was there any restrictions, or was he told not to speak with his alleged co-conspirator?
That's the condition, not about the case. And at that point, when they started discussing that, President Trump crossed his arms, and you could see a little bit of not, being pleased about this condition.
So just to be clear, the judge said that he could not speak with Walt Nada as this case moves forward. Is that correct?
About the case.
About the case. Yes. And so the former president's reaction, he crossed his arms and seemed not pleased about that?
He seemed not pleased about that, and there was a good 20-minute discussion about that. And the government feels like there is a way to be workable about this and to create this list. And this list...
A list, essentially...
Of the witnesses.
A list of the witnesses.
Okay. And so no contact is too broad, no communication.
Okay. Karen, thank you so much. Lester, I'm going to send it back to you in case we're getting some more information. Again, I was just speaking with our producer here in the media over from Karen Duva. I'm going to send it back to you.
All right, some great raw reporting there. Let's go to Adam Reese. He just stepped out of the courtroom. Adam, give us what you have.
Lester, good afternoon. The hearing just completed. It was 47 minutes long. Earlier, prior to the hearing, Mr. Trump and Walt Nauta, his valet, were booked at the same time when they arrived at the courthouse. In the courtroom, the attorneys were lined up on both sides. On Mr. Trump's side, he was represented by both Todd Blanche and Chris Kise. He sat with his hands early on clasped in front of him. On the other side, you had David Harbach with the special counsel's office, Jay Bratt, the assistant to the special counsel, and Julie Edelstein. More than 40 reporters filled the courtroom, court officers, Secret Service. Judge Jonathan Goodman began the hearing. He thanked the chief judge for the use of the courtroom. He thanked the U.S. Marshals. He thanked the clerk for making all the arrangements. And he said that Mr. Trump's hearing, first appearance, would go first, then Mr. Nauta. He welcomed the attorneys, and he said that Mr. Trump's attorney, his second attorney, Todd Blanche from New York, was welcomed pro hoc vice, which means that he was allowed to represent him here, even though he's not part of the Florida bar. Again, Trump sat most of the hearing with his arms crossed. Blanche said they waived the formal reading of the indictment, and they entered a plea of not guilty. That plea was entered by Todd Blanche. Essentially, Mr. Trump didn't say a word throughout the entire 47-minute hearing. They requested a jury trial, and they said there's a standing discovery order. I will just go through it quickly for you, Lester. Essentially, there was a lot of back and forth, and that's why something that's typically 15 minutes long, a first appearance and an arraignment, took so long, because the judge was actually going beyond what the prosecutors wanted. The judge said that he wanted to impose special conditions to essentially have Mr. Trump avoid all contact with witnesses and victims unless through counsel, meaning Trump cannot contact anyone, including Mr. Nauta, about the case, very specifically about the case. Long story short, after back and forth between the defense and the prosecution, they came to an agreement that the judge said that he will be very specific, and that the government will come up with a list, one list. It won't be exhaustive. It will be narrow in terms of scope, and it will reasonably accommodate Mr. Blanche, Mr. Trump's concerns, and the restrictions will be limited only to contact about the case. So essentially, the upshot is that Mr. Trump can't talk to any potential witnesses about the case. And essentially, Mr. Nauta went next. Mr. Nauta, his valet, kept his chin down, his eyes down. He was very subdued. He went through the same process. His arraignment, because he did not have a Florida-based attorney, his arraignment will be on June 27th at 9:45.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a moment to call attention to the motorcade. Appears to be leaving the courthouse now. We've seen a couple of SUVs making their way out of the garage. One of them carrying former President Trump, who has now, through his attorney, pleaded not guilty to the charges against him regarding often referred to as the documents case. There's the aerial shot. Adam, I'm sorry to cut you off because you have a lot of rich information. Please continue.
Well, Lester, I want to mention about that specifically. When we left the courthouse, we were able to look from the 5th floor back out onto the street in the front of the courthouse and in the rear of the courthouse. And we had heard talk of thousands of people showing up. Well, we didn't really see that. But when I left the courthouse, we did see hundreds of people on both sides of the courthouse gathering, whether they were Trump supporters or anti-Trump protesters, we don't know. But as you see from the aerial shot and the ground level shot, that there were large numbers of people here showing up for this arraignment of Mr. Trump. The judge went on to say that the same challenges with the co-defendant exist with many of the witnesses as well. One of the key witnesses is still the president's lawyer, and that's a big problem. So this is all from Mr. Blanche. He said the facts of this case are everything in Mr. Trump's life, especially it relates to his staff and Secret Service. Mr. Blanche said he's very concerned how Mr. Trump can go on in his everyday life dealing with his staff and his Secret Service when he's not able to communicate. So they came to an agreement. He can communicate with all these people until that master list is given by the government. He can communicate. He just cannot discuss the facts of this case or discuss any of this with witnesses related to this case. Mr. Blanche said in reference to the prosecution, he said, look over there. There are 13 lawyers. The government said that there is a way to make the court's decision workable. The elephant in the room, the government said, is we don't have a list yet. There isn't a list of witnesses yet. They promised it won't include every conceivable witness that they might call at trial. The judge made a final decision. He said, I'll take one list from the prosecution. It would be no contact, no communication about the facts of the case without approval of counsel. Lester?
All right, Adam, thank you. I just want to point out again, we're looking at ex-President Trump's motorcade now. It was a number of people appeared to be able to run up to the former president's car. We saw him wave as it came out of the garage. We saw police. Well, there it is. Police apparently subduing one individual who appeared to charge the vehicle carrying the former president. But they're on their way to the airport, leaving the Miami area after this. As Adam was reporting, a 47-minute arraignment. I want to bring Laura Jarrett into the conversation right now. We learned a lot from Adam there. What stood out to you?
So that we had wondered whether there would be any conditions on their release. Not that we thought that they would actually have to give up their passport, but on this issue of Mr. Trump and Mr. Nauta being able to communicate, given that Nauta still works for him, even traveled here with him, and yet is still a co-defendant, an alleged co-conspirator, we had wondered whether there would be any conditions. And we've now learned from Adam and all this great reporting that the judge, actually not the prosecution, but the judge actually said they are not supposed to communicate about this case, which you might wonder, well, how is that supposed to work in reality? But the whole point of it is so that they can't collude on their testimony. They can't try to get their stories straight. And because this investigation is ongoing and the prosecution is worried that Mr. Trump doesn't know all of their witnesses who have testified, including, it sounds like, some employees of Mr. Trump, they're worried about providing
Hold on a second. Our reporting has been that they traveled together to this arraignment
Yes.
today. I don't know if that meant they were in the same vehicle, but it sounds like they'll be able to be together, but just not have that
Exactly.
conversation.
They'll be able to travel together. He'll still be able to work for a minute. It sounds like the judge acknowledged the unusual circumstance we're in, given that he's still a current employee, but they're not supposed to talk about this case. They're only supposed to talk through their attorneys. And we had wondered whether they were engaged in some sort of joint defense situation. We have to do some more reporting about that. And for people at home, the reason that matters is because of the attorney-client privilege. And so if they have a joint defense agreement, their attorneys can talk without having to worry about any privilege. They can share information. They can essentially be aligned in their defense on this case. And so we have to learn more about that. But it is interesting that the prosecution is going to have to turn over a list of witnesses, other people that the former president cannot talk to when it comes to this case. And again, the whole reason for that is because you're trying to protect that witness testimony, protect the integrity of the investigation. There may be witnesses who are coming before the grand jury in this case, and also coming before the grand jury in the January 6th investigation. And so that's also a concern. Again, shows you just how complicated the legal situation here is for the special counsel. And it's interesting, that this went on for so long, and it sounds like it was really largely led by the judge. As you heard Adam say, this is normally a thing that takes 10 to 15 minutes. This is a short procedure, but it sounds like the judge was trying to be careful and methodical and impose some conditions that even the prosecutor wasn't asking for.
But not required to give up passport or eliminate travel.
That's to be expected.
Hallie.
And that's important because remember, this is a candidate who is out campaigning, right? Who is holding rallies, who is holding events. He'll do one later on tonight in Bedminster, as we've reported. We expect to see him there. So a travel restriction, if that were to be the case, and I don't think anybody expected that, would have created major issues as far as infringement of free speech and what you can do when you're running for office, et cetera. I just also want to make a point to what we're watching here and the former president's motorcade heading presumably back to the airport to fly off to Bedminster. We had a shot at one point of people running alongside the car, and Secret Service agents, it appeared, running alongside the motorcade as well. That is highly unusual.
I've never seen that.
That is not normal.
For a Secret Service protectee, I've never seen anything like that. People getting close to the vehicle like that. Here's the video. We can show you just a moment here.
And they speed up in the car, and the car even turned.
That individual was arrested. We saw, or at least apprehended.
More people seem to
part of the
try to run
reason
in.
this is happening is because the entire perimeter was not secured in the same standard way that we see so often, and so people were allowed to get much closer. So, I mean, people at home should understand there are people walking through right now all over the place in an area that would normally be completely locked down.
And this is the person that rushed the vehicle being carried away by police. Let's go to Sam Brock. Sam, I don't know if you were able to see all this, but you can certainly read the temperature of the crowd and how it reacted when the motorcade began to roll.
Yeah, look, it's very, very difficult to even comprehend something like this could happen, Lester. When it comes to a person rushing at the motorcade, we'd seen an incident prior to former President Trump's arraignment earlier today when someone came at the motorcade and had to be pinned down, essentially, perhaps a replay of that. But I do want to comment for a second on what the U.S. Secret Service has said about the security dynamic in general here. Namely, this is not a U.S. Secret Service situation or template. They might be leading the perimeter of the House, but what's actually, or courthouse, excuse me, what's actually happened today has become alarming to officials. And we do have one official telling us they're not concerned about the safety of the protectee, former President Trump, but they are mindful that Florida is a concealed carry state, and that poses potential risk, especially if large crowds assemble, which you see behind me. You have a higher likelihood of people carrying weapons. So the slightest combustion point could very quickly escalate into some problems. And thankfully on this side of things, that's not what we've seen play out, Lester, but I haven't seen any indication of metal detectors or anything that would sort of be a screener for people, depending upon what they would be carrying here. And then on the other side of the building, where the motorcade actually left, people, as you and Hallie were just commentating on, rushing right at the motorcade. I mean, that is unheard of, right? So as I'm standing outside, walking around here, this plaza area, it's all compressed, it's all together. You have members of the media, you have demonstrators, you have people that live nearby that took their dog out today and decided, should I go watch the arraignment of a president or walk down the street? And they're all in this same space together. And the number one concern from the U.S. Secret Service was specifically the lack of hardened barriers around the courthouse area. How could you have a situation where there's a street right here, people just walking up, essentially, undetected or without going through any level of screening and just kind of hanging out at elbow to elbow here, face to face in the middle of this plaza. And thankfully, we have not heard any reports of anyone injured. And I did question Mayor Francis Suarez in Miami about this specifically earlier today, said that they had no credible intelligence of any sorts of violence, and they wanted to try to respect the line between free speech and security. Where the rubber meets the road on that, I guess, is really the question. But again, no incident so far today, as there are still people assembled here. But gosh, that video that you were just playing, or perhaps are still playing, of what it looked like when the motorcade left the courthouse, and you have people, demonstrators, running at the vehicle, is really a hard idea for an American public to try to wrap their head around, especially with the political climate and the violence and the rhetoric that we've heard in this country in recent months. The fact that that was even allowed is going to raise a lot of questions.
Yeah, and Sam, we should point out, and Hallie backed me up, and this is someone who did the White House beat for a very long time, but typically ex-presidents are not afforded the level of a protection detail, the 20, 30 long motorcade. So we
still get some protection,
yeah, sure,
right? And it's still the Secret Service's responsibility and obligation to make sure that they're protected. As you heard Sam report, and I hadn't seen our team reporting that, and so I'm grateful to him for bringing that to us. They were less concerned about Donald Trump himself, more concerned about the situation more broadly. It is just, I mean, and of course, former vice presidents, et cetera, get Secret Service protection for a short period of time after leaving office. It is just so unusual to see this, especially for somebody with as high a profile as Donald Trump and who draws the kinds of crowds that Donald Trump goes in many places that he visits here. You know, the security apparatus around him before he even was in the White House, right? When he was running for president back in 2016 existed, obviously when he was in the White House and then for this period of time after. And I just think there is going to be a lot of reporting to be done on the sort of nexus between what Miami has done, what the Secret Service wanted. I'm just going to share my personal experience, Lester, because you asked. I've been to tons of Donald Trump events in his capacity as president, before that, after. There's always bike racks. I mean, that's one of the things you can bet money on that you'd see at an event. And I'm talking about those barriers that kind of separate protesters, media, people doing their business, the former president. I have been walking around this site for hours. I haven't seen one, right? And it just speaks to the nature of this security footprint being very different than the security footprint we've seen.
Well, Frank Figliuzzi knows a lot about security, a former assistant director for counterintelligence. Frank, you watched all this play out. You watched the people run up alongside the vehicle. I was wondering what you were thinking during all that.
Yeah, Lester, we talked earlier about what appeared to be a less than optimal security environment and plan. And I've just spoken with someone familiar with the security plan down there, and they described it as the city of Miami digging their heels in, so to speak, about what their wishes were for that egress of the president and not complying with requests, multiple requests, I'm told, for a hardened perimeter, closed street for the egress, and people unable to approach the motorcade. So, as has been said, if you're talking about someone that could have been armed, that individual we saw approaching that was arrested could have had a gun, could have fired off a round at the motorcade, and things would have gotten very serious at that point. So, again, if this is going to be protracted, if this is going to trial, if it's going to happen in Miami, there needs to be a revisiting of the security apparatus and planning.
All right, Frank, thanks very much. Joining us on the phone is NBC News producer Adam Reese, who stepped out of the courtroom a minute ago. We talked to him on the phone, and Adam rejoining us. Adam, I just looking over the notes here, make sure I'm clear. Walt Nauta did not enter a plea. Is that my understanding?
That's correct, Lester. He just had his initial appearance. Because he did not have a Florida-based attorney, he could not make a plea. So his arraignment will be later this month. But I did want to pick up where I left off. When Todd Blanche, Mr. Trump's attorney, entered the plea of not guilty, requested a jury trial, standing discovery order, and then the judge issued the Brady order, which basically says that the government must disclose all exculpatory evidence. And Lester, I just want to mention a few other conditions that I didn't mention earlier. The government recommends that there be a personal recognizance release. Some conditions, they don't view the defendants, Mr. Trump and Mr. Nauta, as flight risks. The judge allowed a personal surety bond with no financial component, and he said that the person, Mr. Trump and Mr. Nauta, may not commit a federal, state, or local crime. They did not request Mr. Trump's passport, and they did not impose any international or domestic travel limits. So, and they also did not request anything related to firearms or contact with the co-defendant. Again, back to what I had mentioned earlier, that he cannot have any discussions or any mention of this case with any of the witnesses or employees with him.
Adam, let me interrupt you here. We're looking at the pictures. The motorcade obviously has stopped in front of what happens to be a popular Cuban restaurant here in Miami, Cafe Versailles. We don't know what the game plan going forward is, but the motorcade has stopped. You can see that protection detail now fanned out in the streets. And I believe we're going to see him. There's the former president. Guad Venegas is somewhere there in the crowd. Guad, what can you tell us about this stop?
Lester, there's supporters have been waiting here for hours now, and you can hear the crowd cheering. We're actually right. What you're seeing is a glass that separates the outside of the Versailles Bakery. We're right outside the glass. We can see Donald Trump speaking to supporters. Local politicians have been waiting for him for some time now. And I'll go back to you as we... We'll keep the camera on Trump.
Mr. Trump, but just to be clear, this was a planned stop. Maybe lost Guad as well, but we'll watch this scene play out. Hallie?
Yeah, sometimes you see presidents do this, obviously former presidents do this, make this kind of unscheduled, quote-unquote, surprise stop to a place, a location. In this instance, there's Guad. It's Cafe Versailles. Very classic campaign stop. Politicians, people running for president visit here quite often. Obviously, a lot of supporters who have crowded in there. Obviously, we have no microphone next to him. We can't hear what he's saying.
But this goes back to what we were talking about. Is this Donald Trump candidate or Donald Trump defendant? This looks like the candidate.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because presumably in the minutes after a federal arraignment, you would not be going and making a stop and talking politically with all of your reporters, right? And this, supporters, I should say. And so this is an instance where you're seeing Donald Trump do what he often does. Find people who are loyal to him, feed off the energy of a crowd that likes him in a moment when he is feeling attacked.
And in a moment, the nation is watching.
And in a moment, the nation is watching. He is somebody who, they say it all the time, right? For years, he kind of controlled those so-called banners on the bottom of the screen, those words that say right now, Donald Trump visits supporters. He understands the power of an image. And this is part and parcel of that, it seems to me.
All right, but if you're a Republican now running for the nomination against Donald Trump and you're watching this and you've been afraid to criticize him, tell me how that works out.
I think you hold your powder like we've seen many of them do, Lester, obviously with the exception of Chris Christie, who has been one of the more vocal voices against Donald Trump. What I have heard is that you have some people, as he gets closer to our microphone, I'll stop talking, but you have seen some people waiting to see where does the wave go. That's how one Republican campaign source put it to me for a rival campaign. We don't need to ride the wave now. We can see where the wave goes. Don't get out too early criticizing Donald Trump, but keep your options open.
In another context, this would be described as a victory lap, but far from it. Far from it. This is a man that less than an hour ago, or just minutes ago, actually walked out of a federal courthouse, indicted for the second time since April. We're going to hear him. Here we go.
Thank you very much, darling. You take care of yourself. Where's Jorge? Right here, sir. Come on, let's get a picture. Come on. This guy, great champ. Just don't fight him. On this way, sir. Justin, on this way. Tiene que salir de presidente otra vez. Tiene que salir otra vez. Look at the outside. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Some birthday. Some birthday. We got a government that's out of control. What a great group of people. What a great group.
Guad Venegas is there at the Versailles restaurant. It's a Miami landmark in the Cuban community. And it is where Donald Trump and his motorcade have chosen to stop before heading to the airport and on to Bedminster in New Jersey. What, Benega, can you hear me?
Lester, yes, I can hear you. We're standing just a few feet away from where Donald Trump is speaking to local supporters. This is a significant stop. Lester, you mentioned, why is Donald Trump here? Well, this Café Versailles in Miami is sort of the headquarters of Latino Republicans. This is a place where they've come once and again to demonstrate in favor of Donald Trump, in favor of the Republican Party. And this stop will have a lot of meaning to that community in South Florida and in Florida in general. This is a Latino community that has supported Donald Trump from the beginning. And today they've shown up here in the dozens. As you can see, he continues speaking to them inside the bakery, Lester.
And the crowd singing happy birthday to the former president. Tomorrow is his birthday, to point out.
It's worth noting, Walt Nauta is alleged co-conspirator and body man, even with him in this moment. You can see him off to the screen at different points. We'll probably see him in a few minutes, still serving as sort of the go-between for him and some of these supporters.
And if I understand the order right, he's allowed to
he's allowed to be with them,
just not talk about the case.
He's allowed to travel with him, just not talk about the case. But again, just the optics of it, just minutes after appearing in court together, in a sort of a celebration stance, the kind of thing you might see after you've been cleared by a jury instead of after your first appearance in arraignment.
He made a few comments, and it was very difficult to hear, but essentially rigged, corrupt system, teased ahead, quote unquote, and I'm using news producer parlance, but talked about the speech that he is going to be delivering later on tonight in Bedminster. But these are the first comments that you are hearing from the former president. Again, unsurprising in concept. This is what he has Truth Social. Now he is sort of saying it verbally here to this crowd of just adoring supporters with, as Brad points out, an important political context and backdrop here in South Florida as he gets ready to head back in his car and presumably now head on to the airport to fly up to Bedminster, where they are ready for him. They've got the chairs out and ready to go.
Chuck Todd, you're watching this. Your thoughts?
Look, surreal. We've always run out of adjectives to describe anything Donald Trump does, but my word, I mean, we've not seen something like this in the United States before, where a political figure like this is under legal threat and he goes to celebrate, and there are people there ready to celebrate, and we've seen this take place in other countries where you've had corrupt, political figures accused of corruption do this, and sometimes they've had success, sometimes they've had failure. It's a very familiar scene to South Floridians watching sometimes the politics of Central and South America, where you see these moments. But clearly he is wrapping himself in the sort of, there is a faction of South Florida, very conservative MAGA Hispanics who are very much rally around, sort of almost see common cause of the injustices of America with Cuba and Venezuela, and he's trying to wrap himself in this, in the sort of the folks who claim they're exiles in the exile community, and it's a real perversion of what the exile community used to fight for. I mean, this is what makes it so surreal to see it here in the United States. We were the safe haven for those that were escaping moments like this. It's just, what a bizarre moment. And I think, again, it's going to take years for us to understand it.
NBC's Garrett Hake was in the courthouse during the entire arraignment. Garrett, tell us what you saw, your impressions, the color in the room, if you will.
Well, Lester, I saw a former president who appeared visibly irritated to be in that room at all today. Unlike in the New York arraignment, by the time reporters were brought into the room, Mr. Trump and his counsel were already seated. And for most of the hour or so we spent in this courtroom together, he sat with his arms tightly crossed against his chest and spoke only to his co-counsels on either side of him. He did not do his own not guilty plea that was made on his behalf by one of his attorneys. And I never saw him turn over his shoulder to look towards the center of the courtroom. If he had, he would have seen Special Counsel Jack Smith, who was sitting behind the prosecutor's table in the audience himself, watching over the proceedings. Smith, much looser, in conversation with attorneys around him, off and on throughout the course of the proceedings. Mr. Trump at a table with just his attorneys. I did not see any of his political aides, family members, anyone else accompanying him in and out of the courtroom today. But, we've been through two of these now, Lester, and I have to tell you, having covered Donald Trump as a candidate and as the president and now as a criminal defendant, you can tell that he is, this is not a person who's put in a situation in which he is not in control all that often. And to be a guest of the state, to be not have his personal freedom for even that period of time, where he has to sit and wait for reporters and members of the public to file in, to be told to stand by a judge and when to sit by a judge, is not a situation in which he finds himself comfortable. And he expressed that physically throughout the course of the hearing. On the way out, again, not making eye contact with anybody else in the room, never turning towards the prosecution's side of the room for the duration of the time that he was in the room. Among the prosecutors, a much lighter atmosphere. At the end of the hearing, as the prosecutors filed out another door, Jack Smith, the special counsel, coming up, kind of slapping another prosecutor on the back, throwing his arm around him as they left the room together. So kind of a fascinating scene, having, again, now covered two of these. The sort of visible discomfort that Donald Trump presents while in the room under the control of, in this case, federal marshals and the Secret Service protecting him, but also keeping him in custody in that hearing room. Lester?
Garrett, did Mr. Trump have any family members accompanying him?
No one, Lester. Likewise, in the New York hearing, no family members, no personal aides, no political aides, and in this case, not even Boris Epshteyn, who's kind of been a legal consigliere to Donald Trump on these other cases. He appeared but didn't speak in the New York case. In this case, it was only the two federal attorneys, Todd Blanche and Chris Kise, who attested to the judge that they'll be Mr. Trump's attorneys permanently, they said, for both trial and appellate purposes going forward. They and the protective detail that accompanies Mr. Trump everywhere as a former president, the only people joining him in the courtroom today.
All right, Garrett, thanks. Let's go to Gabe Gutierrez. Gabe was also in the courthouse for the first part of this hearing and arraignment. What were some of the things that stuck out to you, Gabe?
Well, Lester, some of the things that Garrett mentioned, just how surreal it was to see the former president of the United States in a courtroom having to see all this play out and staying silent. Now, this hearing was different. According to the people who were in the room for the entire arraignment, the former president did not utter a word. That is different from the first court appearance from the first arraignment 2 months ago, where he did enter his guilty plea. What's also different, Lester, is we're just starting to see these sketches from inside the courtroom. Remember, this is different from the arraignment in Lower Manhattan, where a judge did allow some pool photography, those still images, and the cameras in the hallway. We did not see that here. And if you can see, as we're looking at that sketch, I can tell you that was what I had described earlier. The far left of that sketch was Walt Nauda's attorney. Then second from the left right there is Walt Nauda and Todd Blanche, former President Trump's attorney, there in the middle. Then the former president, obviously, and then Chris Kise to the far right. That is how the courtroom was laid out. Behind that is where members of the media, including Garrett and some of our other colleagues, were there. I can tell you from watching from the media overflow room, watching the attention of the world, really looking at this federal courthouse in Miami, is just incredible to see a former president go through this. I can tell you also, Lester, as someone who grew up in Miami, seeing the former president now in Cafe Versailles, as you have been describing, a landmark here in Miami, also incredible to see. I was there during the 2016 election in the hours after the former president was, President Trump was elected, and there was incredible celebration there. So it's frankly no surprise, really, that he would head there before heading back to New Jersey. Also striking, and I believe my colleague Laura Jarrett mentioned it, to see Walt Nauda there with the former president in that video as he went to Versailles. So many questions about how this plays out. Of course, Walt Nauda now back here potentially later this month for his formal arraignment once he gets local counsel to sponsor him. He has not yet entered a plea. But so much of this is unprecedented in terms, will what type of conversations will the former president be allowed to have with Walt Nauta to other members of his staff? And that is an outstanding question that his legal team wanted clarity on. Who can he speak with? And again, according to our colleagues reporting that they came down at that question by saying that he can speak to his employees, they just can't speak about the case. But also, along with Garrett, having covered 2 of these arraignments now just in the past several months, just a surreal experience to witness a former president of the United States, first arraigned on state charges, now arraigned in the federal court system. Just a remarkable scene here in South Florida. Lester.
All right, Gabe Gutierrez, thank you for your excellent reporting from the courtroom and coming out to give us some more of the details. I want to bring back our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker, for some final thoughts about what we've seen, where this goes, and what the lasting impact of all this could be. Kristen?
Well, Lester, I keep thinking about the fact that I was outside the courthouse in New York when former President Trump was arraigned for the first time. And the word that keeps coming to my mind as we watch these extraordinary scenes unfold is the word somber. This is yet another somber day for this country. A former president has now been indicted on federal charges. It will undoubtedly deepen the divides within this country, make the election cycle that much more complicated and complex, and yet the nation awaiting to see if there will be yet more charges. So the politics of it we will continue to follow and track. But Lester, this is an inflection point, yet another inflection point for the country as it wrestles with these deep divides around the former president, around these legal challenges that he is facing, Lester.
And Laura, I want to get your final thoughts, but I'm thinking about how we've talked about this was a pretty perfunctory thing. A federal supposed to be, exactly. Your thoughts?
Obviously, a remarkable moment in so many ways and a highly unusual first appearance here at a federal courthouse. But it's just, again, I think worth marking that we are at the beginning of a very long road. I predict the 3 of us are going to have a lot more conversations about the legal complexities of this case as it moves forward. And it will just be interesting to me to see how much of the legal defense matches up with the political defense we've heard. We've heard the defense of I can do whatever I want as it relates to these documents. I wonder if that will hold up in the court in terms of what his legal team actually puts forth, because that is not what you might call the most robust legal defense to what he's facing here in court. But it'll be interesting to see how those 2 perspectives align.
And worth noting, we could be here, again, when I say here, in a similar situation before the summer is out.
Perhaps in Fulton County, Georgia, or perhaps in Washington as it relates to the special counsel looking into the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. If you go micro and macro, right? Micro, small picture. What does this mean for the Republican field going up against Donald Trump in the race for the White House? We have seen nothing if not Donald Trump have the ability to capitalize on what he sees as attacks against him to make sure that he keeps his grip on the Republican base, a Republican base that will largely determine who ends up going up against President Biden in the race for the White House come 2024. At what point, if any, do some of these other candidates, I'm not talking about Chris Christie, start to sharpen their attacks and go after Donald Trump? Would it be after potentially a Georgia indictment? Would it be after potentially another January 6th indictment from the special counsel? Big picture, this attack on the Justice Department, the idea that the Justice Department has been weaponized, which, again, many Republicans believe based on polling. I hear it a lot in my private conversations with people in Republican circles. What does that do to undermine that institution in this country? A Department of Justice that is supposed to have independence, supposed to be perceived as having this independence to be able to conduct investigations, including on the most serious elements of United States national security. Over and over and over again, Republicans are hammering the DOJ, even those who are being a little more nuanced in their criticism of Donald Trump, calling these allegations perhaps serious. How does that play out, big picture, as it relates to the norms of the Justice Department and its proceedings?
The fact that there's much more time in the summer, potentially more indictments along the way. The question is sometimes do the number of cases begin to work in his favor from a political standpoint?
Does it become, and again, from a political standpoint, does it become noise to people who hear Donald Trump and legal problems and who have been hearing that since 2015, Lester?
Yeah. All right. Allie, thank you. Laura, thank you. That concludes our NBC News special report. We'll have much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now. And tonight on NBC Nightly News, I'm Lester Holt. Thank you for watching, everyone. So long for now from Miami.
Trump pled not guilty to all 37 counts. It was a 47-minute long hearing. Trump sat with his arms crossed, they said, appeared visibly irritated the entire time, spoke only to his co-counsels. One of his attorneys, Todd Blanche, entered his plea of not guilty. Walt Nauta did not enter a plea as he doesn't have a Florida attorney there with him, so he will have to reappear. The judge gave special circumstances. Mr. Trump will not be allowed to speak with any of the witnesses or potential witnesses about the case. He will still be able to talk with them, but just nothing related to the case. Hundreds of people were there on the grounds, both supporters of Trump and the anti-Trump camp, as well as members of the media, all there together, sort of clustered in on the grounds. Didn't seem to be any conflicts among the protesters. As former President Trump's motorcade left, there were people trying to run alongside, and one man was arrested after charging the motorcade. There were no travel restrictions placed on Mr. Trump. And a lot of the talk was about whether Donald Trump was showing up today as a presidential candidate, which it sure seemed to be, as he left former President Trump's motorcade, then made its way to a very iconic Cuban restaurant called Versailles. And they called it kind of a headquarters for Latino Republicans. Definitely cheers packed with people, all supporters of Trump. You weren't able to hear a lot, but we did hear him say food for everyone, and they then sang him happy birthday. His birthday is tomorrow, so definitely felt more like a campaign stop than a stop after an arraignment. We'll have more coverage on that, ValleyNewsLive.com.